Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku had the wolf's trust part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below. And let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story 𝗵𝗃𝗲_and you_princess from 𝗬𝗏. So let's start the video. School chapter text. There is a world that is filled with two kinds of magic. Right-handed magic, or better known as light magic. Then, there is left-handed magic, known as dark magic. Because of the growing population of those who can wield magic, a school was built to allow those who had the gift of magic to better learn their powers, to learn their speciality of magic and better control such a thing. Yet, in the world, just like there is good people, there are bad people. Those who abuse their magical abilities to do harm to others who are unable to use magic. Better known as magicless. Those who can use magic. Some are either just gifted with such an ability to use magic. Others were born with it due to their bloodline. How, you may ask? There is families who had once been with either demons or angels, both of which are able to use magic, but unable to transform like their ancestors. Instead, they are only able to use their magic. Magic to help the innocent, or to use magic to hurt the innocent. The world, it should be a rather peaceful place, one would think. Or at least, as peaceful as one would expect it to be. There have been times where either demons would attack out of nowhere. Humans, who almost seemed to be mad with power for no reason, just wanting to hurt those who needed to be destroyed. No one knows why, never finding out why humans, demons, or the odd angel would go mad and be driven insane to the point of attacking humans. No one ever learned what the cause of such a thing could have been, or what it still was, as these attacks have been going on for centuries. Until a certain young woman and her familiar was able to learn the truth about the cause, as well as how the unexpected is to be expected. Running through the halls was a young woman wearing a long dress. The sides and back of the dress was a green that one could mistake for a jade in color, while a strip of pink that started from the collar of the dress, going down over her breasts, stomach, waist to the ground. Her black slip-on shoes clicking on the hard floors as she ran, hoping to get to her next class. A class that she hated more than anything, but hated the idea of being late just as much. Once she arrived, she slammed the door open with her free hand as she looked around. Everyone had been chatting among themselves. She looked around and saw all of them, wearing robes and of course having creatures with them. All of them, or at least most of them, were animal-based demons, guardians, and so on. Yet soon, all of their gazes fell upon the green-haired woman as the door finally closed behind her. They all laughed while one called out, "Look, it's 𝗵𝗃𝗲. Why is she even in this class? She doesn't have a familiar." Yup. That was right. Young 𝗵𝗃𝗲 Inko, a young woman, didn't have a familiar of her own. Why? Not a single one wanted to be around her. Most likely because of her angel blood that she got from her mother's side of the family. Reaching up, she tucked a lock of her long green hair behind her ear, trying to tune out the students as she went to get to her seat, only for someone to stick their foot out and trip her. Inko yelped out in shock as she fell onto the stairs, thankful that she wasn't hurt, but doesn't mean that it hadn't hurt her feelings. She had been at this school for a month already, and she had no familiar because no matter how hard she tried, no demon would go near her. Not even some of the other creatures that were told in myths and legends. All witches or wizards during their first year would gain a familiar, but for some reason there wasn't one for her. It had made Inko to become an outcast, made her wonder if she would ever get one. Yet at the same time, it made her think that maybe she was meant to be a witch that never got a familiar in the world. But a small part of her still wanted one. A companion to watch her back during battles, or even if it was just to keep an eye on her. Company while the couple friends she had were out and about on their own, living their own lives. Just someone that could keep her company, even if it was just a little bit. She wanted someone that she could confide in when it couldn't be her friends. But the way it was right now, she doubted that it would ever come to be. Pushing herself up, Inko went to make her way to her seat, until she had nearly fallen again. Yet, she didn't feel the stairs upon impact this time. Blinking in confusion, she saw that she had arms around her, causing her to crane her head to the one that held her in their arms. "𝗬𝗪𝗏," Inko said in shock. Standing there was indeed her friend 𝗬𝗪𝗏, a tall man, just a few feet taller than her. His long black hair, shaggy as it was, mostly hung in his face, hiding his exhausted-looking dark eyes. He wore a long black cloak that hid most of his body from view, but that was how he liked it. Though, there was something different about 𝗬𝗪𝗏. He moved quickly, yes, but that was still far faster than he should have been. more so since she hadn't seen him in class. A cat-like grin grew on 𝗬𝗪's face only to giggle. "Usagi?" Inko asked, assuming that it was indeed the one that she was thinking about. "Caught me," said 𝗬𝗪, before getting up onto her feet, and a puff of smoke appeared around the 𝗬𝗪 lookalike before a small black cat took its place. Jumping up onto Inko's shoulder, the cat looked up at her with bright silvery blue eyes as she said, "𝗬𝗪 is waiting for you in your usual seat, Inko," she said with a giggle, nuzzling the green-haired woman's cheek. "Thanks, Usagi, for the save," Inko said with a smile, petting the cat before making her way up to the top step. "About time you showed up," a tired voice called out, causing Inko to look over, and there was 𝗬𝗪. The real 𝗬𝗪, her best friend since she came to this school. He looked up at her before making a gesture with his hand to get her to sit down and sit with him. Once she did, he grabbed a hold of her and turned the green-haired young woman in her seat, making her face him. "Why do you let them torment you, Inko?" asked 𝗬𝗪 as he checked her over for any kind of injuries. "There isn't much I can do. Even if the teachers do tell them to stop, it won't do anything. I just find it rather childish for them to abuse me like this," Inko said with a soft sigh. It was rather difficult, and rather annoying that people would stoop this low in the first place. Sure, she didn't have powerful magic right now, only knowing simple stuff for the time being, but to torment her just because she had no familiar. That was just a new low. More so since all of them were young adults, just nearing their 20s by this point. If you would just pick a familiar, Inko, none of this would happen, 𝗬𝗪 mumbled as he tended to a small cut on her face. "It isn't that easy, 𝗬𝗪, you know that. No one wants to be my familiar, so I'm at a loss with what I'm supposed to do," Inko answered with a soft sigh. It was true, it didn't matter what she was to do anymore. Until they graduated in a few years, they were all learning to use their magic, but there was still so many things that they had to go through in order to graduate. 𝗬𝗪 frowned a little in concern before pulling his hands back. He let out a soft sigh before rubbing the back of his head. "I know that, Inko, I do. But if you can find someone that is willing to be your familiar, just take it." Inko looked at her friend, pain in her eyes. "I can't just do that, 𝗬𝗪. A familiar is one that isn't just chosen in the dark. If you feel that connection, then you know that you have chosen. Choosing in the dark isn't something that should be taken lightly." Turning her gaze away from her friend, Inko calmly said, "After all, not everyone can find their familiar in the middle of the road, badly hurt and bleeding. I resent that," Usagi said with a mock pout, only to giggle as she moved around on 𝗬𝗪's shoulder, moving from the left shoulder to his right. "I was in a fight, and I was just so happened to have been weaker than the other demon," she pointed out with a giggle. Inko and 𝗬𝗪 just shook their heads at the cat, or to be more accurate, the 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗀. A simple one-tailed demon cat, mostly a trickster, but would come in handy in what 𝗬𝗪 wanted to do with his life and his magic. Stealth and night type of tasks and missions. "You're just lucky that I like cats, Usagi," mumbled 𝗬𝗪 before turning his attention to the podium. "Teacher's here," he added, causing Inko to look over at her friend before placing her main focus on her teacher for the time being. Maybe focusing on the teacher would allow her to calm down and relax enough to forget about what had happened before taking her seat. It made her think, why did she pick this class? A class about the types of demons and the like that could be your familiar, and the classes that they themselves belonged to. Inko sighed softly as she sat on a bench outside. Classes seemed to have happened in a blur, and it made her wonder what more there could be about this place. What more was there for her to learn right now anyway? Looking over at the trees and gardens that surrounded the courtyard, watching as all the other students are training their familiars. What was it like to have one? Most of the students have either just gotten their familiars, or had them since birth or around then. Her family didn't have that pleasure of having one to be passed down from generation to generation. 𝗬𝗪 and her other friend 𝗧𝗪 had luck for the most part. 𝗬𝗪's he found 𝗧𝗪 well, she couldn't remember what it was. She'll have to ask him later on. Sighing softly, the young woman reached for her little lunch bag and pulled out a sandwich before nibbling on it. It made her wonder what she could do right now. What should she do in order to get a familiar? Sure, she knew that she couldn't force it, but how would she know that she had found hers? Not to mention, if it would ever happen for her. Maybe she should just go back to her previous thoughts. That she would never get a familiar, that she would be the only witch in the world to never have one. Letting out a soft sigh, the young woman curled up on her seat as she tried to think on what she should do with her free time right now. Maybe she could practice some of the spells that she has been struggling with. Looking down at the ground, she tilted her head a little as she saw a simple stone that was resting on the ground. Maybe that was something that she could use to practice her magic on. Reaching out with her right hand, Inko's hand glowed a soft pink as the aura surrounded both her hand, as well as the stone that rested on the ground. It seemed that it would shuffle on the ground, though not enough to float yet. Frowning, Inko clenched her hand into a tight fist as she tried to put a little more of her strength into her magic, all of her focus in the hopes that it would rise up, just to leave the ground at the very least. Breathing deeply, the young woman wanted to groan a little, unsure as to what would happen. It just seemed that her magic still was far away from being strong enough to even do a simple task. Soon, the stone started to lift just the tiniest bit off of the ground, making her let out a small yes at the little victory. Though, before she could try to lift it higher, her focus left as well as her hold on the stone. It fell to the ground as she let out a small groan and leaned back against the bench as she sighed softly. Why did magic have to be so exhausting? Inko, came 𝗬𝗪𝗏's voice, causing her to look up and frown. There was 𝗬𝗪𝗏, holding a small black bag, most likely his lunch. Then there was 𝗬𝗧𝗏 on his shoulder, causing her to feel a slight twinge of envy, but pushed it down right away. How can she be envious of something that she's never had in the first place? Something wrong, 𝗬𝗪𝗏? Asked Inko with a frown on her face. No, you seemed lost or concerned about something. Maybe rather focused or something. 𝗬𝗪𝗏 mumbled before taking a seat next to the green-haired woman and started to unwrap his own lunch. Pulling out some little cubes of meat and set it in a bowl for 𝗬𝗧𝗏. Here you go, he whispered before the cat jumped down from his shoulder and sat next to the black-cladded young man before happily eating her food. So, how should we go about this? Go about what? Asked Inko with a frown, having taken another bite out of her sandwich. About getting you a familiar. 𝗬𝗪𝗏, Inko, you need a familiar. Look at 𝗬𝗧𝗏, for example. No one would ever guess that she's a demon, only that she was just a cat for the magicless to cuddle and be protected by. 𝗬𝗪𝗏 mumbled before turning his gaze over to the green-haired woman. The cat in question was still just munching away at the food before her. I just worry about you. If you had a familiar, then they would finally leave you alone and have someone to protect you should you need to be. 𝗬𝗪𝗏, I don't need a familiar. Yeah, I'd love to have one, but like I've said, not a single demon wants me. The problem isn't with my choice. It's me. They don't like me, they hate me. She let out a soft sigh before shrinking a little on her seat before looking at the ground. It makes me think that maybe I'm just not good enough for the demons here. Turning her gaze over toward her friend, the young woman couldn't help but let out a sad sigh. It's just that I just feel like I'm not lovable. 𝗬𝗪𝗏 placed a hand on her shoulder, causing Inko to tilt her head a little in confusion. Inko, he began, making her wonder what it was that her friend would say. Don't think like that. 𝗬𝗧𝗏 loves you. She has no problem with you at all. If it wasn't for the fact that I was the one that found her, she would have gone to you. You sure? Inko said with a sniffle. Yeah, demons are about honor and repaying debts, he said with a small smile before withdrawing his hand and looked up at the sky. I saved 𝗬𝗧𝗏's life that day, yeah, but she actually likes me. Sometimes, when you save a demon, and they are able to repay you, they can easily grow attached to you. Turning to the cat, Inko was sure that she had seen 𝗬𝗪𝗏 smiling. She saved me once, a year after I found her, and still stayed. The debt was repaid, but she wanted to stay by my side. Because she loves you, right? Yeah, love is a strange thing, Inko. Our familiars are like our friends, our family. It is because of that is what makes our magic stronger. Looking over at the young woman, 𝗬𝗪𝗏 leaned back a little as he pulled out a jelly pack from his pocket. Where did he hide those? He must have some kind of hidden pocket within the pocket, with how many of them she finds him going through in a day. Though, was 𝗬𝗪𝗏 right? Would she find her familiar and love him, or her like her best friend? No matter if she did save their life or not. She wasn't sure, but wondered what fate had in store for her, and any demon that she would have. Or, well, assuming that she had a demon for a familiar, or even an angel. There could be anything that would happen. Yet, at the same time, she felt like no matter what, no one would ever want to be her familiar. After all, she wasn't that good at magic, even though she already knew one advanced magic spell. Nothing great though, just helpful if someone was injured or needed to be calmed down, though the calming spell wasn't as advanced as the healing one. Running a hand through her hair, the young woman couldn't help but feel emotionally drained. Maybe she would need to think things through. Maybe she would need to go talk to a teacher if there was a way to get a familiar. Maybe outside of the school gates was someone that was willing to be hers. Or perhaps that was just wishful thinking on her part. There was no way of truly knowing, wasn't there? Sighing softly, the young woman looked over at her friend and saw that 𝗬𝗧𝗏 had finished eating her own lunch and settled on 𝗬𝗪𝗏's shoulders again. Just wrapping herself around his shoulders and snoozing away. Usagi truly was a lazy cat. Made her wonder if she would ever jump into action when the need arose. Though, maybe 𝗬𝗪 just spoiled her a little too much with her being a cat and all. There was no telling with those two. Then again, some people did spoil their familiar as well, and regardless what they were. 𝗬𝗪, I'm going to ask one of the teachers. Maybe they have an idea on how to get a familiar. Possible. Maybe there was a case like yours once before. After all, no hurt in asking, right? He said before pulling out another jelly packet. Seriously, where does he keep those things? It was rather strange, and it made her all the more curious before she let out a soft sigh and pushed herself up onto her feet. You're going to ask him right now? Asked 𝗬𝗪. Yeah, maybe he even needs help with something since it's my week to help in the first place. I'm sure Gran Torino has an idea on what can be done about this. If not, well, at least I tried, right? Inko said with a smile before walking off. After all, what could go wrong with asking? Meanwhile, deep within a forest was a giant black furry creature running through the trees, breathing deeply, trying to get away from their attacker. Blood dripped from the small cuts along its skin. The creature looked left and right, trying to get away from the attacker that was after it. Snarling a little, it made a sharp turn, hoping to get away as quickly as it could. Once it was sure the bushes could keep it hidden, the creature looked around once again. The creature's instincts telling it to run, knowing that there was no way that it could defeat the one doing the chasing. Snarling a little at the thought, the creature shook its fur, hoping to remove the blood from its fur, but it only agitated its injuries more. Sniffing the air, the creature walked out of the bushes, thinking that it was now safe to get out, only to yelp as something wrapped itself around the creature, lifting it into the air and squeezing. The animal yipped out in shock as it tried to escape its binds, thorns piercing its body, blood oozing out from the wounds as it tried to get away once again. You won't get away from me again. Never again. You will give me what I deserve after all these centuries of chasing you down, said the hunter to the creature. A sickening smile on the hunter's voice as he laughed like a madman. To think, you were hiding out here all this time. Didn't think you'd dare hide. I thought that your fate was much worse, but this is even worse than what I thought. The hunter chuckled a little more, wanting to laugh like a madman once again, until his crazed gaze looked over at the furry creature. You don't even remember who I am, do you? No, you are nothing but a mindless beast, following your instincts instead. No matter what I do, you won't even know why I'm even doing it in the first place, the hunter said with a chuckle. The creature narrowed its eyes before letting out an angry howl as blue and red flames started to surround its body. The hunter cried out in pain and shock as the forest started to burn, burning the creature as well as the hunter. The last sound that was made was angry howls that almost seemed to echo through the forest. Inko let out a soft sigh as she made her way to her teacher's classroom. Honestly, she had nothing against the teacher. He was just rather strict with a few things. But he saw something in her that he had once seen in a dear friend of his. At least, from what she had been told. There have been stories about the teacher that he was in the council with a friend of his, stories, some true, some false. No one could really hard to tell which ones were truth, and which ones were lies. Walking down the halls, the young woman couldn't help but notice a few students looking at her, and whispering among themselves while looking at her. Inko felt a little nervous, hating it when people looked at her like that. Few of them even had sneers on their faces as they look at her. It made her rather uncomfortable, but she tried to ignore everything that was happening. The only sound that she tried to focus on was the sounds of her shoes clicking on the floor. Maybe if she just focused on the sound of her shoes, it would distract her enough to ignore her fellow students. That was something that would help make her feel better at the very least. Peeking up through her lashes, the young woman saw that she had arrived to her destination. Looking up, she saw her teacher's name on the door before letting out a soft sigh. She knew that he had asked her to come down to help with something. He had told her once before that she was the only reliable student that was here. Plus, he even told her that he wanted to keep her safe from the idiots that attended this school. Knocking on the door, Inko waited, having heard a gruff grunt of annoyance before calling out, 1 minute, and a few more grunts. Mumbling about stupid books, have to move them, or something along those lines. Before she could even think about anything else, the door opened and revealed a tall man wearing a yellow robe that all but covered his frame from anyone that would look at him. He had a black domino mask that only covered his eyes. But his eyes held a bit of kindness that contrasted with his gruff personality. Inko could only smile at her teacher. Hi, Gran Torino. Ah, Inko. Good, I was expecting you come in. Gran Torino said as he walked back into his empty classroom. Inko looked around as she walked into the room, seeing that he had books scattered on the desks and floors. as well as scattered paper. Though that was to be expected, he wasn't much of a clean person, but he would still clean up before class and just leave it in disarray until maybe a couple hours before class and clean. Turning her attention to her teacher, Inko asked, "So what is it that you need?" Tilting her head a little as she wondered what it was that her teacher needed this time. See, I need some help gathering some herbs for my class tomorrow," he calmly said before walking back toward Inko and held out a basket, as well as a map. "I promise it shouldn't take too long, but can you do this, please?" "Sure, I don't have any homework or anything today, so I have time," Inko said with a cheerful smile. 𝗵𝗃 smirked a little before carefully laying out the map on his desk. Inko blinked as she looked over at the map, wondering why he was showing her the map in the first place. Oh wait, maybe the herbs only grew in a certain part of the woods. Maybe. Looking up at the older man, Inko couldn't help but be a little curious as to what it was that he would say to her. Though her gaze fell back onto the map, 𝗵𝗃 pointed to a fork in the path that resided on the map. "I need you to listen carefully, Inko. I need you to take the left path here. There have been sightings of a wolf demon running rampant and wild in the forest, but so far only on the right side. It seemed that the wolf made that part of the forest his home. Avoid it at all costs," he explained before turning back to look at her. "Just know, the moment you are in his sights, you are as good as dead." Inko gulped a little at that. If a demon like that was out there, why hadn't he been taken care of? Why was it still roaming around like a normal animal? Was it that powerful? As if sensing her concern, her teacher gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Do not worry, Inko. As I've said, he stays on the left side of the forest and has for the last 10 years or so. Just listen to my instructions and you'll be fine." Turning her gaze back onto her teacher, she knew that he wouldn't have sent her into any kind of danger. After all, if the wolf had stayed in the same spot for so long, there had to be a reason for it, right? Nodding slowly, the young woman whispered, "Has anyone ever tried to just go and attack the demon at all? No, no one dares to try and attack him. No one knows the rank of that demon. As of right now, he is seen as an unknown class, as we can't get a true study on him. But we figure he is rather old for the most part. Even some of the other familiars know about him and never dare to cross his path," 𝗵𝗃 explained before rolling up the map and handed it to her. Giving her a calm stare, he calmly said, "But, should you be in danger, just say the enchantment that would teleport you out of the forest." Oh right, one of the spells that she was still struggling with. How was she to use it in the face of danger? Though, should it come down to it here? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper with what looked like some kind of circle with 2 triangles intertwining with each other, and stars lining the edges, as well as resting in the center of the circle. "This will call me the moment you feel like you are in danger, or at least when you call upon my name." "So I have to call Gran? No. 𝗵𝗃 let out a small laugh. "Sorry, it only works on my real name. You'll have to call out 𝗬𝗪𝗍. Of course he tells his students an alias, and this only works on his real name." Inko let out a mental sigh before nodding her head. Maybe everything would be all right. After all, what were the odds of anything terrible happening in the long run of this? If she had anything to say about this forest, Inko had to say that it was rather creepy. Looking around, the trees, for the most part, made her think of some kind of nightmare from a horror movie. She frowned a little as she noticed the black trees. Some of them had crimson leaves while others had no leaves. You could barely even see any sunlight in the forest. Only slivers of light would come through the branches and leaves, at least giving anyone any kind of indication of light through the forest. Looking around, Inko didn't see any demons, or even any animals for that matter. That had confused her, but maybe they were sleeping. Perhaps the demons and animals here were nocturnal. Giving herself a mental shrug, the young woman pulled out the list of herbs. They were all residing in the forest here. Smiling, the young woman looked around, knowing the herbs and at least, as well as some pictures next to the herbs, should it have ever came down to not having been able to find any of them. Humming gently to herself, the young woman would kneel down a couple times, picking up herbs and plants, as well as a few flowers that were on the list. The humming was mostly to calm herself down while in this place. She would take quick glances around the surrounding area, wanting to make sure that no one was going to attack her. Even though she should be fine, after all there hadn't been anyone here. More so when she hadn't seen a single demon or animal as of yet. Maybe everything was fine. Maybe she was overthinking everything. Though at times like this, she wished that she had some music playing, as it would help her being distracted. But sadly, there was no way for her to have her own music out here other than her humming. Letting out a soft sigh, Inko pushed herself up, wiping the grass off of her dress before she started to walk further into the forest, thinking that maybe the rest of the herbs and flowers would be deeper into the woods. Looking around, the young woman couldn't help but frown all the more. There was an odd smell hitting her nose. It didn't make sense to her, making her wonder why that smell made her wriggle her nose. It wasn't a pleasing scent, it was just a little unnerving, telling her that there was some kind of danger around, though she couldn't really be sure as to what it was warning her about. Shaking her head, the young woman looked down and saw a few more flowers and herbs. Smiling, she giggled a little before kneeling down and carefully started to pick some flowers and herbs, making sure that she got most of what she needed, as well as any extras should that ever come up. Gran Torino, strict as he was still a fair man, though she couldn't help but wonder why he would look out for her. Honestly, she got like a grandfatherly vibe from the man. There had been a couple times that he would step in to stop some of the bullying when he would catch it. Though, it still didn't stop any of the students from trying to bully annoy her because of something that was still out of her hands, such as her having no familiar. Pausing in her task, Inko let out a soft sigh before shaking her head. Okay, she'd be lying if she said she didn't want a familiar. Honestly, she did want one more than anything in the world. But, like she had mentioned, no one wanted to be her familiar. Inko figured that it had something to do with her angel blood. Demons for the most part shied away from such a thing, even though she wasn't a pure-blooded angel. Yet, it didn't stop the demons from thinking that she would purify them in some way. Though, Inko had no idea on how to even purify anything. None of her spells could do such a thing, and it made her all the sadder. Sighing, she started to double-check the list, and saw that she still had one flower left. It was a plant that only grew a couple months a year. If she remembered right, it didn't need a lot of light, and mostly needed to stay in the shade. Smiling at the thought of that, Inko started to make her way deeper into the forest. Seeing that it was a little brighter further down the path, it made her wonder why that was in the first place. Looking around, she saw that there were a few bare spots in the bushes, as if something had burst through them. The scent that she had been smelling for a while now started to get stronger. Frowning all the more, Inko couldn't help but look around, unsure as to what was going on. Tilting her head, she couldn't see anything, and thought that maybe there was nothing left there right now. Shrugging to herself, Inko started to make her way over to a small bush of flowers. Burning hearts, Inko said with a smile on her face before she happily started to pull off the red heart-shaped flowers and started to put them in the basket. Yet, as she turned her head, she couldn't help but blink her green eyes as she looked down and saw a trail of blood. That was rather strange. Was that why the animals and demons had left this place? The blood was a little overwhelming, but she couldn't help but allow curiosity get the better of her right then and there. Carefully, she started to follow the trail, unsure as to what was going to happen at the end of the trail. But for all she knew, someone was badly hurt and bleeding out. What if they were dead even? There was no way of knowing what it was that was wrong, but she knew that she had to do something before they either died, if there was a chance of helping them. Gulping, the young woman started to make her way deeper into the forest, unsure as to what she was to expect while looking around. Maybe she was just going to find an animal or something along those lines. A soft sound reached her ears, causing her to gasp before jumping into the bushes with her basket landing outside of her hiding spot. Carefully, she pulled the leaves and branches aside from the bushes, thanking her lucky stars that the bushes were black and the red leaves. Coming into her line of sight, out of the surrounding darkness, was a wolf. The size of the creature, at least from what she could gather herself, was nearly her height, while it stood on its 4 paws. Black fur, it looked so soft from what Inko could make out. Wait, was that a head of short fluffy blonde hair with 2 locks framing his face? Before she could think of anything else, Inko could faintly make out something dripping from its fur. Is that blood? Inko thought to herself with a frown on her face. Rather confused, and at the same time very concerned. The wolf almost looked like it wobbled unsteadily on its legs, yet kept on walking, as if there was nothing wrong with it. Heavy breathing reached her ears, as if the wolf had ran a marathon to get away from whatever had attacked him. Wait, something or someone had actually attacked it. Was this the wolf that people had been talking about? No, how was it here? It should be on the other side of the forest. There is no way that it should be here. Gulping, Inko noticed the wolf stopping in its tracks for a moment, black ears flickering as it looked around. Oh wait, she remembered that her teacher called the demon a boy, but was that even true? The wolf turned toward her for a moment, panting as if it struggled to catch its breath, though just seemed to be looking at her blankly, but not really registering that she was even there in the first place. The only thing that she could make out was the most beautiful of blue eyes. A thunderstorm swirling within their depths, as they were surrounded by a bright and golden yellow hue. Inko couldn't help but feel rather captivated by such eyes. Eyes that seemed to hold untold knowledge, but at the same time held onto a wildness that no one could tame. How was it that this wolf was alone if it could be this calm while alone in the first place? Snorting, the wolf started to walk away until his massive paw hit her basket, causing her to want to curse outright, thinking that she had messed up the moment it found her basket. The wolf just looked down at it before tilting his head and carefully picking up the basket with his sharp teeth. Teeth that could easily rip her apart if she dared to reveal herself to him. But what was she to do? She needed that basket, not wanting to go back empty-handed, and Inko followed the wolf the best as she could without making a single sound. Every time she saw the wolf flinch and look around, she stopped dead in her tracks, thinking that maybe she was messing up already. Yet, the wolf would just let out a huff before walking further into the forest, leaving a trail of blood in his wake. How was it that the wolf was losing this much blood and still able to keep moving like it was in that moment? Force of will. Stubborn. A will to live. Wait, didn't that count as a force of will? Either way, Inko knew that she couldn't just sit there. She'd have to follow the wolf to where it was staying and find a way to get the basket back, and of course take it away from the wolf before anything else happened. There was no way that she would go back empty-handed. Narrowing her eyes in determination, the young woman followed the wolf deeper and deeper into the forest, hoping that this wouldn't really take long. Though, she just hoped that she would be able to just quickly grab the basket and make a break for it before the wolf would see her and, of course, try to rip her apart limb from ever-loving limb and most likely eat her. Though, that would be hard to say at the same time. So, there she was, a young woman following a known feral wolf that, should it decide to pass judgment, would and could very well kill her should it ever come to it. What am I getting myself into? Inko could only watch as the wolf walked further and further into the forest. What was he doing in the first place? Why did he take her basket? Did he think it was food of some kind? If that was the case, then why? Wolves aren't known for eating plants but meat. It had her rather curious as to what this wolf would even do in the first place. Carefully, she kept following the wolf, making sure to stop herself in her tracks every time the wolf would stop and look around. She would hide and pray to whatever god was listening to her, or even just willing to listen to her. Though she highly doubted that it was much at this point. Her whole life, her family had told her to never believe in gods. Gods tend to only let you down in the end. As for why that was, Inko didn't really know, but it still didn't stop her now and again from still praying when she felt like she would be in some kind of danger. Now was one of those times at the moment. Taking a deep breath, hoping to calm her nerves, the young woman kept following the wolf. Blood still dripped and oozed from his injuries. It was rather strange to see something, demon or not, to bleed this much and not pass out from blood loss. It just didn't make sense to her, but she just hoped that she would be able to maybe even help him. Even now, the wolf seemed to tremble on his legs as he walked. It was slight, but Inko could still see the struggle the wolf had as he walked. Concern started to rise within her, wanting to reach out to help the wolf, but knew that she couldn't do that. He was feral and would have gladly tried to kill her if she got too close or even was within its sights. Gulping, the young woman ducked into the bushes when the wolf stopped and started to look around, sniffing the air as if trying to find any kind of hint of someone following or at least nearby. A soft snarl ripped its way out of the wolf's throat, causing Inko to think that maybe the wolf found her. Oh God, did she have to start praying again? Please, please don't let it be the case that the wolf found her. The wolf just seemed to have let out a grumbled growl before walking on ahead, his body still trembling and shaking like a leaf. It made her heart ache at the sight of such a thing. Frowning all the more, the young woman once again started to follow the wolf once again. Taking a deep breath, the young woman hoped and prayed that this wolf didn't see her. Blood hadn't stopped its flow. Not even for a second as it kept walking. Its movement starting to slow down and become sluggish. Maybe it was starting to lose far too much blood. Gulping, the young woman started to move a little quicker. But when she saw that she was getting far too close, she had to slow herself down to avoid being seen. Soon enough, though, the wolf had stopped at what could be counted as a dead end that was covered in what could be seen as a leaf bed. Comfortable looking to say the least, but Inko couldn't help but blink in confusion. He set the basket aside before using his paw to tilt its contents over onto the bed and set the basket aside and moved it away from his bed. Inko couldn't help but frown a little at this. What was the wolf trying to do now? Blinking in confusion, she watched as the wolf curled up on the bed and laid his head on the pile of flowers and herbs like it was a true comfortable pillow. The wolf let out an exhausted yawn before closing his blue eyes. She wasn't sure what to do. Honestly, it felt like this was some kind of trap or test of some kind, and it made her all the more nervous over the whole thing. Taking a deep breath, the young woman made her way carefully over toward the wolf, yet would hide away into the nearest bushes that would be within her range, at least when she would fear that he would wake up and attack her. It would be hard for her to get the flowers and herbs back, but she could at least get the basket back since it wasn't hers, and didn't want to risk losing it. Frowning a little, the young woman would carefully turn her attention from the basket to the wolf and back again. She didn't want to risk him waking up, but knew that it would be rather easy for him to wake up if she wasn't careful. Though as she made her way to the basket, the young woman couldn't help but blink as she watched the wolf as he slept. His blonde, could she really call it hair? Actually, yes, she will. It was rather fluffy looking, just like the black fur, even though it was coated in dirt and blood. 2 locks of his blonde hair covered his eyes, so that made it harder for her to tell if he was even awake or not. Careful to not even breathe too hard or quickly, Inko slowly tiptoed toward the wolf and slowly grabbed her basket and smiled happily. Grinning to herself, she turned her attention to the wolf and frowned a little. He looked like he was in a great deal of pain, the way his breathing was. Quick, heavy, almost as if he was trying to breathe through pain that was coursing through his body. Blood, now able to look closer, saw that it was not just oozing but nearly gushing out of his wound. How was he still alive? Frowning, the young woman wanted to reach out, wanting to use her healing magic on him in order to make it easier for the wolf so he could sleep easier, but feared that if she touched him that it would end up waking him up. There was no way that she could risk her life if she went to touch him, but then again she also didn't feel right leaving him like this either. Turning her gaze over to the wolf once again, wanting to do something that she could do to help him, but again unsure as to what she could do. Her mind and her heart were at war with each other. Her mind telling her to just take her basket and make a break for it. To just go back to the part of the forest that had everything that she would have to recollect and get back to the school. While her heart, on the other hand, was telling her to just try to heal the wolf and hope and pray that it wouldn't hurt her when it saw that she was indeed trying to heal him instead. Though, at the same time, the young woman wasn't sure if it would even work out the way she had hoped in the first place. Letting out a soft sigh, the young woman so wanted to help the wolf, but at the same time wasn't sure what she should or could do at this point. It just seemed that everything that told her to run away, another told her to just heal him and try to get away from the wolf as quickly as possible. Her heart won the battle as she carefully started to check his injuries. The wounds on his side looked like someone had sliced into him. A few cuts and scrapes revealed themselves to her, and it made her wonder how he got them in the first place. Most of the injuries would take a lot of time to heal, even with magic, and would need to take daily healing sessions in order for him to make a full recovery, and it made her wonder so many things. How did this happen? Was he attacked? How did he get away? Was this why he came here? So he could get away? Frowning a little in concern, Inko felt tears prickling at her eyes as she couldn't help but feel sympathetic toward the wolf as he laid there, obviously in a great deal of pain. There was no way that he should be living like this. No matter how long he had been in this shape, she had to do something to help him. But what could she do? At best case, she could at least stop the bleeding, but not the pain. Her healing magic was still far too weak to do such a thing in the long run. Yet, before she could even think of anything, a growl started to emit from the wolf's chest, causing her to blink in confusion before slowly turning her gaze over to the wolf. Sharp blue eyes narrowed as they bore holes into her green ones, seeming to try to burn holes into her very soul at the very thought of her touching him, as well as her being near him. Inko felt the blood drain from her face as she saw that the wolf was snarling at her. How was it that he woke up? Wasn't he still asleep, or was it that the wolf was a light sleeper? Oh no! Inko shouted before the wolf quickly shot up onto his feet, sending Inko to fall over onto the ground and looked up in fear. The wolf slowly turned toward her and snarled. White teeth, stained in blood mind you, and looked ready to attack. Well, let's just say that the green-haired woman knew what she had to do in that very moment. I have to run for my life, Inko thought with wide, terrified eyes before quickly pushing herself up onto her feet and started to make a break for it. The wolf let out a loud howl before the sound of quick and heavy footfalls rushed toward her. If there was one thing that Inko learned, was that if you wanted to get away from animals, best way to do this was to zigzag, as it made it harder for you to get caught. Now, it was a matter if it would work on demons, though, is another matter in the end. Not wanting to look back, Inko just listened carefully to her surroundings, listening to the way the wolf ran, the way he breathed, or when she would no longer hear him running, and had most likely jumped into the air in the hopes of catching her. Quickly, she made a sharp turn and ran more. If there was one thing that Inko knew for sure, it was that she wasn't much of a runner, but was still doing really well for herself right now. Most likely from the adrenaline pumping through her right at the moment. Breathing deeply, Inko kept trying to run, kept trying to make a mad dash to get away from this place. Wanting to get away in order for her own survival, but wasn't sure on how she would be able to get away. It almost seemed as if there was something against her, telling her that she would have no means of escape. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she tried to make a mad dash. Even her lungs burned as well as her eyes from the freshly falling tears. Tightly shutting her eyes, the young woman found herself rather trapped. Trying to get herself to run around the tree, but the black bark was surrounded by rather thick vines and branches by the bushes. Quickly, she turned herself around and saw the wolf slowly stalking toward her. Eyes narrowed, almost glowing in the darkness of the forest. Back pressing against the tree, the young woman felt her life flashing before her eyes as she just stared with nothing but blinding fear within her green eyes. Tightly shutting her eyes, unsure as to what she could do anymore. Maybe pray? Yeah, that may help her, though at the same time she highly doubted it anymore. Breathing deeply, she mumbled some kind of prayer under her breath, unsure as to what more she could do anymore. Yet, before anything more could even happen, there was a loud whine before a thump. Opening her eyes, the young woman blinked her teary vision as she saw that the wolf's injuries had grown worse and bleeding far too much. His eyes closed, his breath coming in and out rather raspy, as if it was a strain on him to even catch his breath anymore. Without thinking, the young woman rushed forward and checked his injuries over. The wolf let out a soft snarl as he looked over at her. The young woman flinched a little but tried to ignore it, using some of her magic, hoping it would help the wolf calm himself down enough so she could see what she could do. The running around the wolf had indeed caused his injuries to become so much worse. If nothing was done, he could die within hours or days. Frowning, she whispered, "Just hold still, okay?" She tried to be gentle with her words, hoping that would be enough to calm the wolf down. The wolf just laid there. But he was at least still breathing. Taking a deep breath, the young woman was at least thankful that he was relaxing enough for her to do something to help him. Though, he was rather large, and she would have no way to get him to her school for help of any kind. If anything, she could at least heal him a little bit, so that would at least help him, even if it was very little. Looking back to the wolf, she whispered, "Don't worry, I'll help you. Just relax, okay?" The wolf seemed to have just looked up at her with a hint of confusion. It made Inko wonder if he could understand her, though at the same time didn't take any chances in waiting for this. Carefully, she placed both her hands on his side, being as careful as she could while trying to heal him. The wolf whimpered a little and shuddered. Inko couldn't help but wonder what was going on with him. Was he in worse shape than she thought possible? Frowning, she carefully used her left hand to carefully run her fingers through his fur in the hopes of comforting him without the use of her magic. She saw him looking up at him in confusion, or at least from what she could see as confusion. It made her give him a gentle smile, saying, "Don't worry, I won't let you die. Just relax, I can at least get the bleeding to stop." As if understanding her, he laid his head on his paws and let out another shudder before seeming to relax a little more. Smiling happily, the young woman hummed a soft tune in the hopes of it calming him down a little more, though Inko wasn't sure if it would even work in the end. The only thing that she had to focus was healing him to the best of her abilities. Slowly, she turned her gaze now and again to the wolf, wondering if he was even paying attention to her or what she was doing in the first place. His breathing, seeming to get better though, was still a little raspy sounding at the least. Frowning all the more in concern, the young woman tried to use more of her magic in the hopes of healing the more severe injuries. The wolf shuddered a little and whined before Inko stopped a little and calmly and gently let out a gentle shhh in the hopes of the sound calming him down. He let out one last shudder before being able to relax once more. The moment he started to calm down, the young woman pulled her hand away from the wolf and saw that the wolf was still in a good deal of pain from the way he would shiver and shudder from the pain. Kneeling next to him, Inko whispered, "I won't leave you. I'm going to summon my teacher." Though she wished that she had done so earlier, then again wasn't sure if she would have been able to, while she was running for her life at the time, since, well, there was no way of knowing how her teacher was even coming to her in the long run. Pulling out the summoning circle that her teacher gave her, Inko calmly said, "I summon you, Grand Torino." Inko frowned a little when nothing was happening. "Oh right. I summon you, Tsuruhiko," Inko tried, and it glowed brightly, nearly blinding the young woman before dropping the paper and used her arms in order to shield her eyes. "What kind of trouble did you get into this time, Inko?" came a voice, causing Inko to lower her arms and blinked before looking up at the slightly angry expression of her teacher. 𝗲𝗵𝗃𝗁, is that the wolf? The demon that everyone knows about? The one I told you to avoid at all? He's hurt, Inko shouted, causing her teacher to blink in confusion. Blinking her green, now teary eyes, she started to explain. I took the path you told me to take. He was here. He took the basket while I hid and I followed him, Inko, 𝗲𝗵𝗃𝗁 said while crossing his arms. Obviously, he wasn't happy with her that she had followed a known, dangerous demon that could have easily tried to kill her, ripped her apart, and moreover what could have happened should she have been killed off, and no one would have known because she was the only one out there. The young woman couldn't help but let out a soft sigh before looking back to the wolf, gently petting the wolf once again. I know, but he was so badly hurt that he collapsed. I healed him to the best of my abilities, but I can't just leave him like this. He needed help. We need to take him back to the school, or he could die. Inko nearly cried, feeling like she had to help him. The wolf didn't seem bad, just untrained, so to speak. Or at least hadn't known any kind of kindness in his entire life, and maybe this was what he needed. To know any kind of compassion and kindness towards him that would help him heal in more than just physically. Though, at the same time, there was no way of knowing what was to happen. Taking a deep breath, the young woman was about to say more until her teacher raised his hand to silence her. Honestly, she didn't know what was to say next at the moment, but knew that she had to do something. But at the same time, she couldn't deny anything. Inko, he began, causing her to flinch. Sometimes you are far too kind for your own good. All right, we'll take him to the school, but he will be your responsibility. Of course, Inko said with a bright and cheerful smile. Unsure as to what would really happen, but knew that at least he would get some kind of help. Turning her attention to the wolf, the young woman gave him a gentle pat as she said, Hear that? We'll be able to help you. The wolf wagged his tail weakly, and it only made Inko smile all the more. At least, that would be a good step in the right direction, in the hopes of being able to get him on the right track. Though, what also confused her was how he got in this shape in the first place. So many things had happened in such a short time, but maybe she'd find out what had happened. After the trip back to the school, Inko had noticed the students looking at her, 𝗲𝗵𝗃𝗁, and the wolf that they had started to bring back. It had taken a lot of her teacher's wind magic to try and carry the wolf over to the school. Some of the other teachers even looked in on what had happened, or what 𝗲𝗵𝗃𝗁 was carrying. Inko couldn't help but stay a little closer to her teacher, and the wolf that she was with, hoping that they would shield her from anything that would come her way. Though really, she wasn't sure what they were talking. Taking a deep breath, the young woman managed to see a few students coming over, wanting to pet the wolf or even see if he would want to be one of their familiars. The wolf snarled at the students that would dare come to them. One was even stupid enough not to take the warning from the wolf, and the wolf had snapped his jaws, nearly biting his fingers off. Inko carefully pet the wolf, causing him to wag his tail. All the green-haired woman could do was giggle at the idea that the wolf already liked her. It was rather strange, yes, but was happy to see that it was letting her comfort him. He seems to like you, calmly said 𝗲𝗵𝗃𝗁. I wonder why? Inko answered in confusion. Hard to say, replied 𝗲𝗵𝗃𝗁 as they kept on walking. The wolf seemed rather relaxed and content as he floated on the controlled wind. What was the wolf thinking now? Was he thinking that he was some kind of pet? A hostage? Or just a patient that she was willing to get help for him? Honestly, she hoped that it was the last one. For a brief moment, she saw 𝗬𝗪𝗼 poking his head out of one of the classrooms that he uses for when he is either studying, or sleeping, or both. Inko, he said in shock and confusion before walking out of the room and started to walk beside her. What's going on here? He asked. Long story. I don't really know if I can explain right now, but I will later or tomorrow. Okay? She said with a small frown on her face. All right, you owe me some cookies. Cat-shaped cookies. You know me so well. He mumbled with a small smile before starting to walk away. The wolf let out a soft whine, causing Inko to look over and saw that the bleeding had started up again from his injuries. Most likely from the movement he had done in order to get the students to back off. Carefully, she pet the wolf, wondering what she could name him. There was no way of knowing what to name him, but at the same time, she didn't want to do such a thing. What if he didn't stay? After all, naming would show some kind of ownership, and she didn't want that. This wolf, he was his own person. Own animal, demon. She didn't know, and honestly, she wasn't going to push her luck with any of that. Humming a soft tune under her breath, hoping that would calm him down. Just keep him calm, Inko. We're almost there. Nodding her head, the young woman did just that. Making sure that he was calm, whispering to him, petting him, humming, anything really that would keep his mind off of the pain of his injuries. Hoping and praying that they would be able to help him before it was too late to save his life. It didn't take much longer to get to the nurses' station. All of the nurses here were experienced healers and doctors, for both humans and their familiars. "Hey, recovery girl, can you help this wolf here?" called 𝗵𝗃𝗏 as he hoped and prayed that the woman was here. Yes, hold on. I'm coming. I'm old, remember?" called out a woman's voice, causing them to look over at the curtain as it was pulled aside. "So what seems to be the problem?" asked the older woman. She had long white hair, at least from what Inko could tell, as it was pulled back in a bun. Her eyes squinted so she couldn't make out the eye color, but she had a pair of white framed glasses. The older woman wore a simple white robe with many pockets, either for herbs for healing spells, or for her own needs, as she almost never has time to eat her lunch from what she had been told. "Recovery girl, this wolf needs tending to right away," Inko said with urgency, hoping and praying that she would heal the wolf. "What is this wolf?" asked recovery girl. "It's the wolf that the students and teachers have warned about in the forest." "Inko here," 𝗵𝗃𝗏 gestured to the green-haired woman in question. "Had the luck of running into him and nearly got herself killed in the process. The wolf collapsed from exhaustion and his injuries, so she decided to help him." Recovery girl turned her attention to Inko for a moment, just really staring at her in all honesty. The green-haired young woman couldn't help but look away, shifting on one leg to the other before looking back toward her. "Well, she is helping a demon that no one else would. That just shows how big of a heart she has, even though you were foolish for risking your life like that." How was it possible to give praise and be scolded in one sentence? After that, 𝗵𝗃𝗏 moved the wolf over to a bed and helped recovery girl to get him settled. The wolf, though, looked at Inko the whole time. His blue eyes looked worried and concerned, though Inko figured that it was because he was hurt. "Will he be okay?" asked Inko. "Due to the injuries. If anything, he may be bedridden for a few days, even with my help and possible healing factor that he could possess. Since no one ever figured out what kind of demon he is, we don't know what kind of powers he has." Recovery girl pointed out with a soft sigh before starting to get her things. "You may go, Inko. We'll take care of it from here." Inko frowned and nodded as she started to walk out of the door, only to stop as she heard whimpering and small howling coming from behind her. Blinking her green eyes in confusion, the young woman looked over and saw the wolf struggling to get off the bed, trying to follow her. "What's going on? Seems he's frightened and doesn't want to be left alone, or at the very least separated from you," 𝗵𝗃𝗏 said while scratching at his head. Letting out a soft sigh, the older man calmly looked over at the healer as he told her that a sleep spell may be needed right now. "You may go. We'll call you should anything come up." Before she left, Inko watched the wolf, making sure that he was sound asleep before leaving. The wolf, so scared and frightened yet at the same time, seemed that he didn't want her out of his sight. What was going on? Had the wolf decided to see her in some new light? Or was it something more? No idea, but knew that there was something going on. Maybe 𝗧𝗪𝗏 knows. One way to find out anyway. Inko made her way back to the study hall. Having messaged 𝗧𝗪𝗏, or at least for the most part Usagi had come looking for her, telling her that 𝗧𝗪𝗏 is looking for her in the study hall. Of course, the little cat led her toward 𝗧𝗪𝗏, warning her that the man seemed a little disappointed in Inko for some reason. So, to be prepared for what may come their way. It had her a little curious as to what was going on. Taking a deep breath, the young woman made her way over to the study hall and looked around, wondering where 𝗧𝗪𝗏 was and what he wanted to know. It had her curious and rather nervous and maybe even scared. He was her best friend after all, actually the only friend that she had here in this place besides Hizashi wherever he was. Frowning a little more, there was her friend, sitting on a chair with his head resting on his folded arms as he seemed to be sleeping. Tilting her head a little in confusion, the young woman carefully made her way over toward the raven-haired man, hoping and praying that he was still asleep, because maybe she could just slowly walk away, or at least something like that for the most part. Yet, the moment she was within arm's reach, 𝗧𝗪𝗏's head shot up, and he gave her a tired glare. Not because he had been disturbed from sleep, but because of what had happened before. Or at least that was what she was guessing for the most part. "You have a lot of explaining to do, Inko," 𝗧𝗪𝗏 hissed out under his breath. For a brief moment, she thought that his pupils slitted like that of Usagi's eyes. Most likely her power was influencing him for the time being. Not all that uncommon, as sometimes witches, wizards, 𝗧𝗵𝗃 would sometimes tap into their familiar's power with high emotional surges. In 𝗬𝗪's case, he was mad. I can explain, I promise, Inko said, a small amount of panic and fear in her words. 𝗬𝗪 closed his eyes, letting out a soft sigh before he leaned back in his seat. Arms crossed as he looked at the green-haired woman, gesturing with his head to take a seat in front of him. Usagi jumped and curled herself up onto her wizard's shoulder before getting herself comfortable. As she was told to, the young woman sat down on the chair and folded her hands on the table as she let out a soft sigh. Where do you want me to start? Asked Inko. From when you got into the forest. I want to know how you encountered the demon, which everyone knows to avoid like the plague, which we were to never encounter because we'd be dead. How are you the only one to have survived being in his sights? 𝗬𝗪 pointed out, leaning a little more back on his seat. Okay, that was fair. After all, he wasn't wrong. Inko had been warned about him, been told to avoid the forest that he was supposed to reside in. Taking a deep breath, she explained herself as best as she could to 𝗬𝗪, telling him how she went into the forest trying to gather herbs and plants for 𝗬𝗪𝗎. And, should anything happen to her, that she had a summon circle that could summon their teacher should she be in danger. As she gathered the herbs, noticing that she saw no animals, no insects or anything, that it was silent as if something had chased them out of there. Of course, she didn't think anything of it at the time. Then she told him that she had heard something coming, and she did the only smart thing that she could think of, jumping into the bushes to hide and protect herself from the danger that she figured was coming. Unsure if it was an animal or demon. What she had seen was what had surprised her more than anything. For it had been the wolf that everyone had warned her about. How it had just walked down the path and took her basket, covered in cuts, blood seeping and dripping onto the ground. How she followed the wolf to get her basket back. Why didn't you just walk away? 𝗬𝗪 hissed. I didn't want to be yelled at, Inko said with a pout. You could have been killed, Inko, 𝗬𝗪 pointed out. I know that, and I'm sorry. Can I keep going with the story? Sighed Inko. 𝗬𝗪 sighed and nodded his head, clearly annoyed that his friend had done something so risky and dangerous all for a basket of flowers and herbs. Anyway, Inko went back on with her tale, telling 𝗬𝗪 that she had followed the wolf, hiding when she needed to, checking over the wolf's injuries the best that she could from the distance, and what it had gone through to endure such injuries. No idea as to what had happened, and once she found the wolf's, so to say, bed, she had saw that he had used the flowers as a pillow, dumping the basket over before he fell asleep. Once she had made sure that he was asleep, she grabbed her basket and inspected the wolf, seeing all of his injuries, wondering how it was even alive, only for it to wake up and attack her, doing what she could to stay alive. Inko dodged all of the attacks, only for it to collapse on the ground. Inko tried to comfort the wolf as she summoned their teacher, and after that, they started to bring the demon here in order to get it help. With that, the tale was over and done with. 𝗬𝗪 looked at Inko, processing everything that she had told him, thinking everything over and calculating over what had happened since she entered the forest, before she went in, and after the attack. That the wolf had changed far too easily, though that was all Inko could guess. 𝗬𝗪 mumbled before rubbing at his eyes and let out a soft sigh. What do you think, 𝗬𝗪? Asked Inko with a frown on her face. Honestly, I'm not 100% sure myself, Inko. It just seemed rather strange that the wolf changed far too quickly to be possible. 𝗬𝗪 whispered, a thoughtful frown on his face as he shook his head. Letting out a soft sigh, he calmly started to count a few ideas down with his fingers. 1. He could have changed because you were the only one nearby that showed kindness. Okay, that was a possibility. 2. He may have seen some kind of familiarity with you for one reason or another. After all, we have no idea how old he is in the first place. Yeah, that was something. But at the same time, she just couldn't be sure. Then, there is 3. Since you helped him, even after he had tried to attack and kill you, he felt something there, that he had a favor to return for helping him, for saving him from the injuries that he had sustained. 𝗬𝗪 pointed out with a shrug of his shoulders before leaning forward on the table. But one thing is for sure. From what I have seen with you bringing the demon, the wolf, into the school with 𝗬𝗪𝗎, you seem to be able to calm him, to console him, while others just seem to anger him or set him off for the most part. Or maybe it's because of the calming spell I had used on him before. Constant contact with me with the spell in effect allows him to remain calm. It'll wear off completely most likely when he wakes up, Inko said with a soft sigh. I don't know, Inko. From what I could see, I think he does feel a little attached. But time will tell for the time being, 𝗬𝗪 said with a soft sigh. Inko ran a hand through her long green hair, unsure as to what she was to do now. Once the wolf had healed, he would most likely go back to the forest to live his days. Or maybe he would be attacked again. Hard to say, though she just hoped and prayed that he would allow them to heal him before letting him go. 𝗧𝗪𝗧 cleared his thoughts suddenly, causing the green-haired woman to stare at him in confusion. You know, Inko, maybe this demon is meant to be your familiar, the raven-haired man suggested, causing the green-haired woman want to protest until he held his hand up to silence her. Hear me out, Inko. You still don't have one, and I had seen the other students try to get close to him, and he snapped at them when not hearing his warnings. You, though, you are able to get close to him, so I don't think your spell is the only thing in effect here. He had a point there. The spell should have kept him from attacking anyone while under its influence, even before she would strengthen the spell once again by touch. So, what did this mean in the first place? Leaning back in her seat, the young woman tried to think everything over. The way the wolf whimpered as she left the room. How they had to get him to fall asleep in order to get started on tending to his injuries. No one else was allowed to see him, of course, because most likely they would only bother him. Though was it that simple? Okay, maybe simple was the wrong choice to use, as he did try to attack her. Turning her gaze back at her friend, Inko wondered what was to happen, or if he was even right about this. Was this demon meant to be her familiar? Are you so sure? Asked Inko with confusion. It could be possible, but again that is up to the demon. 𝗧𝗪𝗧 said with a shrug. That was a point. There was no way to force a bond with a familiar. And they had their own thoughts and feelings, of course. To force it upon them, it wouldn't make a strong bond, and therefore it would shatter within moments of a fight, so to speak. Taking a deep breath, the young woman calmly said, I don't know if I'll even go for it, 𝗧𝗪𝗧. After all, he is a powerful demon. The most known powerful demon, even if he was in the unknown class of demons. Inko, at least try. Ask him if he wants to be your familiar. 𝗧𝗪𝗧 calmly said with a soft sigh as he ran a hand through his bangs. Inko shook her head. Not that she was disagreeing with her friend. No, it was just that she wasn't sure what she could think. Sure, it would be nice to be the only known witch to not need a familiar, but for her of all people to have a powerful familiar as her first choice. That would be something that would get the others to stop teasing her so much. How would I be able to talk to him? Asked Inko, pointing out that she had yet to hear the wolf speak. That is simple, really. Sometimes familiars are able to communicate with their masters in order to talk. Should they be unable to talk, for example, Usagi? It should be fine either way. Familiars can sometimes chat with their masters through telepathy. It isn't common, but it is at least a way to get him to talk to you. Maybe even learn his name, unless he doesn't have one. Inko didn't really like the idea of being someone's master-mistress. It just didn't seem right to her. They had their own lives and the like. They had their own feelings, and of course, but it made her wonder if the wolf was anything like that. It made her concerned if the wolf even had his own thoughts, maybe some small amounts of feelings, but wasn't sure about that since she had yet to see him in any kind of mood other than aggressive, docile, calm, and, dare she say, whiny. I'll think about it, but I can't make promises because don't forget, there is a chance that he won't want to be my familiar. Inko said with a soft sigh before starting to make her way out of study hall. Toward her own room, wanting to just fall asleep and hopefully be able to just relax and pretend that this didn't happen. Though, she knew that wasn't the case, knowing that the wolf still had some healing to do, and that she still wanted to help him get back onto his paws. Inko sighed softly as she rolled herself out of bed. Her dreams filled with nothing but concern over the wolf in the healer's station. It made her wonder how he was attacked. If he was as powerful as he was, how could he have been as injured as he was? So many thoughts, yet no idea as to what it could have been. Running a hand through her tangled green locks, the young woman pushed herself onto her feet and made her way to her own personal shower. All the dorms had one to prevent any kind of attacks. With them all being young adults, and witches wizards for that matter, there was no telling what could happen. For just like how they were good, there was also bad. So, the teachers had decided to add personal showers bathrooms in the dorm rooms for everyone to use. There was still public bathrooms for the students, of course, should they be in class, so they wouldn't have to go through the hassle of going back to their rooms. Turning on the shower, the young woman couldn't help but look herself over in the mirror. Her eyes, bright green as always, had some dark circles under them. How was it that she looked like she had gotten too little sleep at all when she slept the whole night away? It just didn't make any kind of sense to her, though she just hoped that the wolf was doing better. Stripping herself down of her pajamas, Inko hopped into the shower. She wouldn't have time to check on the wolf, since she had missed her alarm clock. Though thankfully, she had enough time to get ready for class and talk to the healer during a break. Maybe he was well enough to go back to the forest should he want to do so. Tilting her head upward, feeling the warm water hitting her face, she couldn't help but think about one of the many dreams that she had throughout the night. It was as if she was seeing it in some kind of perspective of another. Inko could make out a shadowy figure standing over her, saying something under his breath, but she couldn't make out the words, not even able to read his or her lips. The shadows that surrounded it only made it possible to see his teeth, as they gave off an eerie glow in the dark. The glow of red eyes looking down at him, fear etching itself into her heart. It was as if that shadowy figure was merely toying with her. Well, not her, but whose ever perspective that she was in at the time of the dream. It was as if she was in another world, another body actually, and she just couldn't figure out who it was. It made her all the more fearful, but at the same time she just couldn't just be ignorant about the whole thing. Sighing softly, the young woman washed out her hair before stepping out of the shower and started to get dressed. Once she was done, she grabbed her books for the day and started to make her way to class. Though the one thing that bothered her the most was that everyone was talking about him. Talking about the wolf and hoping to make him their familiar. It made her sick. Did they only see him as a creature to be at their side because they chose to? Not because if he would even want to be their familiar. They have choices as well. The demons, imps, whatever. They have the choice in the matter, and their health should come first. Nothing more, but to them he was just an object. That was what sickened her the most. He was a living creature, one with thoughts, feelings, and emotions of his very own. Okay, he was feral, most likely still is, but wasn't with her after she had calmed him. He had acted different since then, as if a true part of himself finally came to the surface, and because of that, it was enough to get him to relax. But why her? Why her of all people was she able to calm him to that extent? Her power wasn't that strong. She knew that, yet it was powerful enough to do such a task. Letting out a soft sigh, Inko looked up and saw that she was near her classroom, but had a few more minutes or so for her to spare. So, she stayed in the hall, unsure as to what she could do to face the students. Most likely, they knew that she had been faced with a wolf, knowing that he had originally wanted to kill her, but was still able to survive because she calmed him. The only one to have been able to do such a task. But, at the same time, they would most likely torment her in some other form. Looking up toward the ceiling, the young woman let out a groan before looking toward the door. There was so many things that she could have done, but no matter what, being a coward was not one of the choices that she could, or should make in such a situation. Shaking her head, Inko started to make her way into the classroom once again. Yet, the moment the door opened, everyone went dead silent, just staring at her, though not with a leer. Okay, maybe a sneer here and there, but nothing that she could control, sadly. Or at the very least ignore all that much. Taking a deep breath, hoping to calm and steel her nerves, the young woman started to walk on ahead. She could make out a few people whispering about her again. Though this time, it had nothing to do with her having no familiar. It did involve her, but it also involved the wolf. How she had been able to survive such a task, but also how she had managed to tame the feral demon in such a manner. Or even how she had even managed to keep him calm during the whole trip here. So many questions they had, but they wouldn't get any answers from her. After all the time they had tormented her, why would they get any kind of answers from her? May as well get a small bit of payback. Even if it was small, to say the least. Hey Inko, how did you do it? Inko frowned and raised an eyebrow at her fellow student. A little confused. Before she could even ask, they went on. How could you of all people escape a powerful demon when no one else could? What makes you so special? Blinking her green eyes, the young woman wanted to speak, but again was interrupted. It would have been better for everyone if it had killed you. After all, you are annoying to everyone, you're not important, and you are just so pathetic. Inko felt tears prickling at her eyes. Before she could speak, the student yelped out in shock as a familiar cloth wrapped itself around the student and pulled him through the aisle, and right smack into 𝗬𝗪. His eyes ablaze in a red hue as he used his special ability, canceling the target's magical abilities. Inko was able to do such a thing because she has a kind heart. While you only care about yourself, your own abilities, and the fact that you have a familiar, you should remember. 𝗬𝗪 then had his big grin on his face, one that creeped people out. She was able to tame a demon that no one else could. Was able to get that demon to come to the school for help, and whom only wants her company. If I recall, you tried to touch the wolf, despite its own warnings, and it snapped at you. The student gulped, but remained silent. Now, next time I hear you talking shit about my friend, I'll make sure you are kicked out, or that you face a nightmare, again and again for the rest of your days. You don't know dark magic, the student said, fear lacing his words. For my friends, I'm willing to dab into dark magic. Don't tempt me. With that, the raven-haired man released his target and started to make his way to Inko. Grabbing her arm and started to walk with her to their seats, patting the green-haired woman's back, hoping that would calm her down, even just a little. To be honest, Inko was grateful for having a friend like 𝗬𝗪𝗏, though she just couldn't believe that a fellow student would ever say that to her. That they had hoped that the demon, the wolf, had killed her. Don't worry, Inko, I'll bring this up to the headmaster. He'll have something done about such a thing. He doesn't like students tormenting others. But what about you? Inko said with concern. Oh, I only made a simple threat. What he said was out of line, so I'll just get a slap on the wrist. Again. Inko could only shake her head, a small laugh escaping her, though she could really use the laugh right now, couldn't she? Giving her friend a small smile, they sat down as she covered her face with her hands, hoping to calm herself down, disappointed that she couldn't use her own spell on herself, but sadly it doesn't work that way all the time. Some spells work fine with others, can even use them on yourself. But then there are the few spells that you can't use on yourself because, well, it just simply didn't work. You owe me more cat cookies, by the way. 𝗬𝗪𝗏 mumbled under his breath, making Inko giggle a little. Okay, I'll bake some this weekend, she said with a small smile on her face. Though honestly, she just wanted this to be over and done with. Just wanting school to be done for the weekend, so she could relax to the best of her abilities. Wanting to forget about everything that had happened during the last couple days, as well as the students whom thought that they could torment her because of something that she hadn't even meant to happen. Then the fact that they had still tried to get the wolf to be their familiar. So, have you thought about what I said? Asked 𝗬𝗪𝗏. I have. I'll try to visit the wolf on the first break. I want to check on him at least, but I still haven't decided on if I should have him as my familiar or not. I'm just not sure if it is even something that he would even want in the first place. Inko said with a soft sigh, turning to her friend as he just gave her a bland stare. Not that he wasn't paying attention, more like he was just thinking about something. I'm still rather curious. From what I have heard from 𝗬𝗪𝗏, the wolf was rather attached or clingy to you. I wonder if he had built some kind of dependency or instant connection to you. 𝗬𝗪𝗏 mumbled as he leaned against his seat and seemed to be in deep thought. What do you mean instant connection? Some demons can make some kind of instant connection. It could be any matter of things. Some demons do it if they find someone they want to help, someone they feel could have potential, or in other cases a romantic connection. But that itself is also hard to say. He shrugged as he looked at Inko and gave her a small frown. There is no telling what it could have been until the demon speaks to you. If he has seen potential within you, then he may be the familiar that you were meant to have, Inko. Don't let such an opportunity escape you. Then he added, though, it could also still be that he wants to return the favor for helping him when no one else would. Inko blinked her green eyes in shock, but all she could do was nod slowly. Maybe she'll have to think about this some more after all. As class started, Inko couldn't help but think about the wolf. Her mind wandered, hoping and praying that the wolf was all right. She couldn't help but feel concern, thinking that something was going to end up going wrong with the wolf. God, what was she to call him anyway? It just seemed wrong to call him wolf all the time. There had to be something that she could call him, wasn't there? 𝗬𝗏. What could I call him till I can get a name out of him? Thought Inko with a frown on her face. Letting out a soft sigh, the young woman looked down at the teacher, 𝗬𝗪𝗏, who was going over legends of wizards, witches, demons, gods, and the like. She wouldn't lie. There had been a few legendary figures in the course of magical history, though it made her a little curious as to what kind of lives they had lived in before becoming legendary. So many things going through her thoughts, as well as the wolf. It was jumbling her thoughts with so many topics at once that it almost gave her a headache. Just as she was about to take down some notes, the door slammed open, and came one of the healing assistants, causing the teacher to pause in his lecture. What's the matter? Asked 𝗬𝗪𝗏. Is Midoriya Inko here? I am, Inko called, causing everyone to mumble to themselves, rather confused as to why the healer's assistant would need her for, well, anything. The healer, a young woman, looked up at Inko with wide, fearful eyes as she said with wild panic. It's the demon wolf. He's acting wild and out of control. Recovery girl told me to come and get you right away. Please, follow me and hurry. With that, the healer ran out of the room. Go, Inko, shouted 𝗬𝗪𝗏. Leaving her things behind, Inko ran down the aisle of seats and started to make a mad dash out of the room. What could be wrong? What had caused the wolf to act out of control already? It just didn't make any kind of sense to her, though she knew that she had to check on him. Had to make sure that he was okay. Maybe there was something more that she could do for them. To help them when it came his anger problems, feral problem. She had no idea, but knew that she had to do something. What if he hurt someone by accident? That wouldn't be good, and most likely end up with them killing him just so he wouldn't hurt anyone again. The mere thought itself was enough to cause her to go into a panic herself. Picking up the pace, the young woman ran around the corner, skidding on her feet, nearly slamming herself into the wall before continuing with her run. It didn't take much longer to get to the healer's room. The moment she got into the doorway, she saw Recovery Girl on the floor, a small cut on her forearm. Most likely from his claws, but that was beside the point. Slowly, she lifted her gaze onto the wolf who was standing on all four legs. His body trembling, eyes aglow with a hint of a reddish glow to them. Removing the blue from his eyes for the time being. Fangs bared, dripping in saliva, as if he was salivating at the mere idea of eating a poor old woman. Yet the thing that got to her was seeing the blood just oozing from his injuries. He must have reopened them during this struggle. She hadn't seen any kind of blood on the floor, so it must have just been recent. A soft growl reached her ears, causing her to act in the moment. "Stop it," shouted Inko before running into the room and stood before the older woman. Arms spread as she gave him a serious look. It seemed that he hadn't been expecting that. As he let out a small snarl, but backed up a little, almost afraid. "You need to stop this. She was only trying to help you, not hurt you. Why would you want to attack someone that was only trying to help you?" Inko said, anger in her green eyes, yet they shined with unshed tears. Her own body trembled, though with the thought of the wolf not being in the right state of mind, and would try to attack her without knowing that she had helped him before. Yet, what the wolf did next surprised her. The red faded from his eyes, replaced with blue once again before he laid on the ground. He let out a soft whimper and a whine before gazing up at her, eyes filled with regret. As if he was sorry for angering her of all people. What made her so special that he felt like he had to be sorry for upsetting her? Turning back to Recovery Girl, Inko helped her up as she asked, "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, thank you, dear," Recovery Girl said with a smile before making her way over to the cabinet and pulled out some gauze to wrap up her arm from the cut. "I don't know what had happened, but I was just finishing up with trying to take out the stitching to replace them since it seemed he had removed, or tried to remove them." Shaking her head a little, she added, "After that, he just seemed to have lost it. That was when I told my assistant to go and get you. Figured since you kept him calm yesterday, that you would be able to do so again today. So that was why they got her." Turning back to the wolf, Inko couldn't help but frown a little that he would have freaked out so quickly, yet calmed down just as easily just by her presence. Making her way back to the wolf, she knelt in front of him asking, "Are you okay now? Are you calm enough to let Recovery Girl help you?" The wolf just looked up at her, letting out a small whimper. "Just keep him there, dear. I'll tend to him from there, though. I will have to go over a few things with you now, it seems," said the older woman, causing Inko to frown a little in confusion. Reaching out, Inko started to pet the wolf, which seemed to have caused his whimpers to cease. As he just smiled and leaned against Inko's hand, causing the young girl to smile back at him. "Now, dearie, I should bring up that if he stays here, he can't go around attacking people." Inko sighed softly, knowing that much was a guarantee that he wouldn't be allowed here for long. After all, if he had attacked Recovery Girl, one of the sweetest women here, then what could be done for him? Feeling a little defeated, Inko had a feeling though that they would have to send him back, knowing that it wasn't safe for him to stay here. Not for the students, teachers, or himself for that matter. For all they know, he could go and attack anyone in a mere thought. Before she could voice her defeat about him staying for more professional help, she was stopped. "But it seems that he is able to remain calm so long as you are in his presence." Inko blinked at that little bit of information. "Such as how Gran Torino explained to me how you used a calming spell on him in the forest. How he stayed calm the entire trip. How only you could calm him when he was surrounded by students. Okay, that was something but doesn't mean anything really. She just knew a simple calming spell. Okay, it was a bit harder for a beginner, but still wasn't something to really brag about. Inko, I think you are the only one that can keep him calm and in a state of mind where he won't attack anyone. If anything, I think he is the best for you, as you are for him." Inko could only blink up at the healer before looking back down at the wolf. He was just lying on the floor, blinking his golden blue eyes up at the green-haired woman. It seemed that he was either not paying attention because he didn't hold any interest in the conversation, or he was rather content with being petted by the young woman. She couldn't help but smile softly at the wolf. They knew that she couldn't really deny that the wolf wasn't cute. He was darn right adorable, at least to her he was. Yet, Could she ask him to be her familiar? Even though thus far, she was the only one that was able to keep him calm. It just didn't make sense to her. But to look back at the wolf, she saw him just staring at her, wagging his tail. Frowning, the young woman ran her fingers through the demon's fur once again. Do you want to be my familiar? Asked Inko, tears in her eyes. The wolf blinked and tilted his head a little, sitting up the best as he could on his front paws, and licked her tears away. She just stared at the wolf in shock. He didn't want her to be sad. Or was it just his way of trying to comfort her? Unless that was the same thing. Either way, it still astonished her that he, a demon, would want to try to comfort her. I think that's a sign that he wants to be there for you, Inko. Why don't you start the bond now? He's strong enough to handle the influx of magic. Though because we don't know his full amount of power, we'll have to place down a limiter just so it doesn't overwhelm you. She couldn't go against that at the very least. Though she just hoped that it would be enough to help in the long run. Inko watched as Recovery Girl went to a cabinet and grabbed 2 crystals. One was blue, other was green. Blinking in confusion, the young woman was handed the blue crystal. That one will go in your bond link, the other you'll have to place in his. Nodding her head, Inko asked for a pair of scissors. Simple's request, of course. Once she was given a pair, Inko reached to the back of her hair, cutting a lock of her long green hair, but used one of the spare hair ties to tie the cut lock at the back of her head, so she knew where it was. After that, the young woman went to cut a lock of the wolf's yellow hair atop of his head, making sure that it would be hidden by anyone who would see him. After that, she set aside the cut lock of hair on the floor next to her, then started to braid her cut hair onto the wolf's hair, the crystal being woven into the hair so it wouldn't fall out at any given time. Smiling, the wolf licked her fingers before laying his head down on his paws to allow Inko better access. Did he know what she was doing? Once she was done that, the crystal started to glow a soft green hue. After that, the young woman started to braid the yellow hair into hers, making sure that her green hair kept it hidden, not wanting a lot of people to know who her familiar would be yet. Taking a deep breath, the young woman also woven the blue crystal into her own hair, waiting to get it braided properly. Once she finished, the crystal started to glow, and Inko felt a slight influx of power, though not enough to overwhelm her in the least. Blinking her green eyes, the young woman couldn't help but stare at the wolf. Just how much power did he have? Not to mention, just what kind of abilities did he have? So many questions, yet she had no answers in the least. So, does he have a name to give you? Asked Recovery Girl. Inko blinked once again before looking down at the wolf. He was just lying there, resting his hair on his paws, as he just seemed to be relaxing. No, Inko sighed softly as she rolled around in her bed, unsure as to what she could do at this point. It had only been a couple days since she had formed the bond with the wolf, and she just didn't have a name for him. Letting out a soft sigh, she opened her eye a little and saw him curled up on the floor near her bed. Since the bond, Inko hadn't really felt anything different. It just seemed as if she was normal again. And it had her a little worried that the wolf wasn't interested in the bond at all. Why was this even happening in the first place? He couldn't speak, didn't even send his thoughts to her, and it just had her more worried in the long run. Letting out a soft sigh, the young woman crossed her arms, in deep confusion before letting out a soft sigh before pushing herself out from her bed. At least it was the weekend, so that gave her some time to try to get to know the wolf a little more. The wolf, as if sensing her gaze, looked up and wagged his tail. Inko just smiled a little at him. How could anyone find him as anything but adorable? Though, if he didn't tell her his name, then she would have to come up with one in the long run. Sighing softly, she pushed herself up from her bed and ran her fingers through his fur before making her way to the bathroom to change. He tilted his head a little, but went to get up. Inko, though, held up her hand as if telling him to stay where he was. He snorted a little, but laid back down in slight displeasure, making her wonder if he knew that she was going to change or not. Inko gave him a small smile before walking into the bathroom, closing the door behind her as she spent a few minutes getting ready. There had to be something that she could do to get him to tell her his name. Or she'd have to try to pick a name for him, though for the most part he seemed rather smart at the least. Though she couldn't be sure as to how smart he was, so if she was to lay out a book of names for him, would he pick one that was close to his name, or even be able to use a pencil and spell it out? Turning her gaze back to the bathroom door, the young woman couldn't help but wonder what his abilities were as well. What could he do that would allow him to help her in the long run? There was just so many things that could happen, or would happen at some point. But at the moment there wasn't much that she could do for the time being. Sighing softly, the young woman finished getting herself ready, walked out of her bathroom and smiled at the wolf as he still laid on the floor. Ready for some fresh air? I think we both could use some with you being confined to being indoors the last couple days. His tail just wagged happily. Giggling softly, the young woman reached over and gently pet the wolf. Let's go, Inko said with a smile, grabbing a big tin that she had on her table before walking out of her room. Wolf in tow as he walked behind her. Odd that he would walk a little slower than her since he was bigger and had longer legs than she did. Turning her head, she frowned a little and saw that the wolf was limping a little as he walked. Most likely still in pain, it made her concerned for him. Making her way over to him, she carefully pet him as she asked, "Do you just want to stay in the room instead? If you are still hurt, you don't have to push yourself." The wolf, though, just looked at her and shook his head. Wait, he gave her an actual answer. Staring at him with wide eyes, the young woman knelt in front of him a little more as she asked, Do you understand me?" The wolf blinked his blue eyes at her and tilted his head. Did that mean that it was just some kind of fluke? Letting out a soft sigh, the young woman pushed herself back up and started to make her way back toward the main doorway to get outside. The young woman hummed as she held the door open to allow her new familiar outside. He squinted his eyes a little before pushing himself out of the doorway. "We'll so sit in the shade. I'm sure we can find a nice spot for us," Inko said with a smile on her face. He just snorted a little, only to sneeze before walking on ahead, sniffing the air as he tried to find a place to sit down and relax. Inko gently ran her fingers through his fur before following him. May as well let him pick. He was the one that was still sore. Giggling, he found a cherry blossom tree and laid down under the tree. The cherry blossoms blowing gently in the wind, a few of them falling onto his fur, even a few of them falling onto her head. Once she was sure that he was comfortable, Inko sat down with him, making sure that she wasn't leaning on him so she wouldn't disturb his rest. Turning her gaze over at the wolf, she saw that he seemed rather relaxed for the most part, unless it was some kind of front. Yet, the one thing that still concerned her was that she still had yet to sense anything from him. Not a thought, pain, feelings, magic, nothing. Was that normal? Or was it because the bond was still rather fresh and 𝗬𝗧 hadn't had a chance to adjust yet? Though could be anything at this point. But she still had no idea what it could be anymore. Maybe she needed to ask 𝗬𝗪 or something. Maybe he would know. He was smart after all. "Hey Inko," called a voice, causing her to look up and blink her green eyes at her in shock. Standing in front of her was a tall man with long blonde hair that was gelled back, nearly sticking out from the back of his head. He also had on a pair of sunglasses that hid his green eyes from view, and wore simple clothes actually. White shirt with orange sleeves, and black pants with matching black fingerless gloves. Blinking her eyes, Inko calmly said, "Hello 𝗧𝗵𝗲, what brings you by? Just saw you sitting out here and wanted to say hi," 𝗧𝗵𝗲 said with a smile on his face before sitting down with her. He looked over at the wolf and frowned a little. "Is this your new familiar?" he asked, sounding rather curious. "Yeah, he is," Inko replied, gently petting the wolf, who wagged his tail in his sleep. "What's his name?" asked the blonde man. "I'm not really sure. He won't tell me his name, or he is unable to," Inko replied with a sigh before looking up at the blonde-haired man and looked up. The young woman looked at 𝗧𝗵𝗲 with sadness in her eyes before looking over at the wolf. "I don't know his name. I want to know his name, but I have no idea how to get him to tell me." 𝗧𝗵𝗲 frowned a little before tilting his own head before looking down at the wolf. If that's the case, I could ask 𝗧𝗵𝗲. She's a wolf, so maybe that would help with some kind of communication?" 𝗧𝗵𝗲 offered, making Inko stare at him with shock in her green eyes. Would that even work? What if he didn't even talk to her because he still didn't really trust people yet? Oh dear Lord, what if she would have to pick out a name, and one that he would end up hating afterwards? It couldn't hurt to try, Inko. What could you lose at this point? 𝗧𝗵𝗲 pointed out with a small yet kind smile on his face. He had a point. What did she have to lose in the first place? Letting out a soft sigh, she nodded her head. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 of course grinned before he placed his index and thumb into his mouth and blew. To her, it sounded like no sound was being emitted from the blonde. But really, that was part of his spell. A spell that he had created himself to alert his familiar, 𝗬𝗪𝗍, to come to his aid, or to at the very least come when he needed her. No one ever knew what he was doing until he had already let out a noise. A sound that was so high in sound frequency that only 𝗬𝗪𝗍 could hear it. "She should be here in a bit." "Oh, did you bring cookies?" asked the blonde, his eyes sparkling in shock and awe. Nodding, Inko explained to the blonde that she had promised 𝗬𝗪𝗍 some cat-shaped cookies for all that he's done for her the last couple days. How he's been helping her with the bullies, even to the point that he swore that he'd dab into dark magic. just to protect his friends. 𝗧𝗵𝗲's expression. It turned rather dreamy as he thought about the raven-haired man. Inko, of course, knew that 𝗧𝗵𝗲 had an obvious crush on the raven-haired man. Everyone knew about it, or at least people who knew 𝗧𝗵𝗲 knew about it. Everyone but 𝗬𝗪 at the very least. He didn't know that 𝗧𝗵𝗲 had a serious crush on him. Only that 𝗧𝗵𝗲 was a little flirty with him, but that was it. Yet, Inko knew that 𝗬𝗪 felt something for the loud blonde, but wouldn't act upon it. Most likely due to how he was raised at the time, and feared his own feelings at the time. Inko, though, knew that she wanted to set them up, but right now, she had no idea on how to even do such a thing in the first place. Before she could even say anything, a cloth zipped forward, catching everyone off guard. Even the wolf snarled a little from the quick action and looked up. The cloth had wrapped itself around the tin and pulled it away from the little group and into 𝗬𝗪's awaiting hands. "Sup," was all he said before opening the tin and started to nibble away at the cookies. "Don't scare me like that," Inko nearly cried out, though her main focus was to calm down the wolf from the slight scare. "Sorry, but you know me, Inko. I can't resist these cookies of yours," he said with his big grin on his face. Inko, of course, just laughed a little, yet still petting the wolf as he started to settle down. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 blushed before looking away from 𝗬𝗪, most likely trying to get his composure back in order before he would interact with the raven-haired man. "So, what are you two talking about in the first place?" asked 𝗬𝗪 as he took a seat next to Inko, his tired eyes looking between them for the time being before going back to his treats. "Well, 𝗧𝗪𝗲 offered to help me get a name for my familiar. Or at the very least why I don't feel anything from the bond yet. I'm worried that he's not taken to the bond, or there is something else wrong with it." Inko replied with a soft sigh, still petting the wolf who licked at her fingers and nuzzled her to the best of his abilities. 𝗬𝗪 hummed a little in thought. Maybe he had another theory, though he just shrugged a little. Still deep in thought before going back to his treats. Of course he'd be a little too distracted by the cat-shaped cookies. "There is a possibility that he is holding something off," 𝗬𝗪 mumbled. Inko and 𝗧𝗵𝗲 both stared at 𝗬𝗪 and blinked at him. "What did he mean by that, little one?" came a voice, causing everyone to look over and stare at the snow-white wolf. Her eyes, a bright and sparkling silver surrounded by a midnight blue color almost like that of the sky. Her silver eyes being the moon, while the blue was the starry sky. She was a rather large wolf, not as big as the black wolf, but she was also slimmer. Most likely for speed rather than raw power, maybe. "𝗬𝗵𝗲, can you do me a favor?" asked 𝗧𝗵𝗲 with a big smile on his face. "Depends on what it is, little one," was the wolf's response before walking over to him, tilting her head as she gazed at the blonde. "Little one, you have something on your cheek," she calmly said before licking 𝗧𝗵𝗲's cheek, wiping away what little mess was there. 𝗧𝗵𝗲, of course, whined in displeasure. "𝗬𝗵𝗲, I'm not a little kid anymore. Please stop cleaning me up like when I was a kid." 𝗧𝗵𝗲 nearly whined. Inko and 𝗬𝗪, though, just giggled a little, as they wanted 𝗧𝗵𝗲's familiar treating him like that of a child. "Can you please talk to Inko's familiar?" asked 𝗧𝗵𝗲 with a pout on his face. 𝗬𝗪𝗲 blinked her eyes a moment before looking over at the curled-up black wolf. His blonde hair hid his eyes from view, though 𝗬𝗪𝗲 let out a soft grunt. "I can try, little one, but it depends if he even wants to talk to me," 𝗬𝗪𝗲 replied before taking a few steps toward the black wolf and laid down in front of him. Staring at the black wolf before tilting her head and growled a little, as if hoping to get some kind of reply to the black wolf, hoping and praying to get some kind of reply. Inko's familiar lifted his head, staring at 𝗬𝗪𝗲 for a moment before he gave a growl in reply. 𝗬𝗪𝗲 tilted her head, talking more to the black wolf. Little growls, yips and so on were spoken between the two of them. It had the green-haired young woman a little curious as to what they were saying, though she felt like she would never truly know what it was that was happening. The black wolf, though, turned to Inko for a brief moment before looking away and back at 𝗬𝗪𝗲, lowering his head a little, as if he was in some kind of shame. Wait, so did he know that she was worried about not knowing what he was thinking? About the bond itself? 𝗬𝗪𝗲 let out a deep sigh before turning to Inko. He said that he is closing the bond for the time being. He is still in a great deal of pain, and doesn't want you to feel anything, so for the time being he has closed the bond to prevent you from feeling his physical pain. Inko couldn't help but frown at that. He was doing this so she wouldn't feel or share his pain like that. Turning to stare at the wolf, she couldn't help but stare in shock and awe. They hadn't even been bonded long, yet the moment the bond was made, he was already trying to protect her. "What about a name? Did he give any kind of name?" asked Inko with a frown. 𝗬𝗪𝗲 blinked her silver eyes at Inko before turning back to the wolf once again, growling a little before tilting her head at him. as if trying to coax him to give a name. Any kind of name that Inko could call him for the time being. The wolf, though, looked as if he was exhausted, as if talking was wearing him down more than any physical activity could ever do to him. The white wolf blinked her eyes for a moment before taking a deep breath. Turning to Inko as she said that you could call him Toshi, but after that he couldn't make any sense. His voice is rather unclear. It's as if his mind is torn, and with no humanity left. 𝗬𝗍𝗵𝗲 sighed softly before pushing herself back up onto her paws, and made her way over toward 𝗧𝗵𝗲, curling up around the blonde man before looking over at Inko. Though, from what I could make out, it seems that he's been like that for decades. Not a shred of humanity within his head, but you seem to have brought out the sliver that remained with your magic. 𝗬𝗍𝗵𝗲 pointed out with a small shrug before nuzzling 𝗧𝗵𝗲 and seeming to want to go back to sleep. Inko blinked her green eyes before looking down at her familiar. Or Toshi, as he seemed to want it to be called. Though, if his voice cut out, did that mean Toshi was his true name, or just some kind of nickname that he was given long ago? There was no way of knowing, but she couldn't help but smile at the wolf. He seemed calm. The humanity that she had brought out must have been enough for him to be like this. "Toshi, are you tired?" asked Inko with a small smile on her face. Toshi lifted his head and blinked up at Inko before nodding his head slowly. So, he could understand her to a small degree, though only being able to nod or shake his head maybe. So she would have to make sure that she asked questions that he could answer for the time being. At least now she knew why the bond was empty. He was doing this as a means of protecting her. But at the same time, she just wondered, just how much pain was he in, and was there more to it than that? Just how much was he hiding from her at this point? Inko yawned softly as she curled up on her bed. Honestly, she was just happy that it was Sunday, that she didn't have to go to classes for the day, though she still worried about Toshi. Opening her eyes a little, she looked down at the wolf and saw how he was curled up on the floor, just snoozing away. It was kinda cute to see him doing such a thing, but knew that she still had to be careful with him. The bond, for the most part, was still empty, but that must be because he is still blocking it out on his end, so he wouldn't cause her any kind of pain. It had to have taken a great deal of energy from him to have been able to do such a thing from the moment the bond had been placed. Just what kind of demon is he anyway? He seemed like a normal wolf demon, but at the same time she couldn't really be sure if there was something more to it than that. Tilting her head a little to the side, the young woman slowly made her way over to Toshi and rubbed his ear. He let out a soft rumbling growl, though it didn't sound like he was trying to threaten him. More as a calming sort of sound that even brought a relaxing sensation around her. It was as if he was trying to use her own spell on herself to remove all of her worries. "So Toshi, what do you want to do today? How about a nice bath? If anything, I bet you could use one. Who knows how long it's been since you've had one," Inko said with a small smile. Toshi opened his eyes and looked up at Inko and tilted his head, as if thinking about the idea of having a bath was something that he had never thought of. God, just how long had he gone without one? It had her rather puzzled about the whole thing, yet she knew that a bath would do him a world of good at this point. Soon enough, the black-furred wolf nodded his head before pushing himself onto his paws and wagged his tail, as if waiting for Inko to take him to get himself cleaned up. To be honest, his fur was rather shaggy, most likely matted and still stained in his own blood from his injuries. Yet, the blonde head of hair that he had, it seemed a little dark though before she couldn't tell very well with her own fears swelling within her heart at the time. So, may as well give him a bath if possible, though she would need to find something to use as shampoo. Because she had a good feeling that hers wouldn't work for him, given how much fur he had. And then of course there was a chance that his skin would just dry out as well. Toshi, do you have a preference for scents? Asked Inko with a tilt of her head as she looked at her familiar. Toshi just tilted his head up at her. Maybe he never thought about such a scent before though. She knew that she couldn't help but feel a little curious as to what could happen once she would start on bathing Toshi. His tail, though, would wag here and there rather lazily, but he still licked her hand. Smiling down at him, the young woman made her way over toward the door and turned to Toshi. "Stay here, I'm gonna go and get some shampoo for you, okay?" Toshi shook his head. "You don't want a bath then?" He shook his head again. "Not that, I'm not." "You don't want a scented shampoo?" A bark instead and shaking his head. "Or, do you not want to stay here alone?" Toshi nodded to that. Oh, so he didn't want to be alone. But it would be difficult for him to keep walking. That much she knew. And didn't want to exhaust him too easily. That would make it harder for her to bathe him afterwards. "Toshi, it's best that you stay here. It isn't like I can just carry you to get shampoo," Inko said with a frown on her face. The wolf, though, just looked up at her and blinked his blue golden eyes at her in confusion, looking down at himself before looking back up at Inko. Soon, his body started to steam, causing the young woman to stare in shock and nearly cry out in shock. Thinking and fearing for the worst before the steam seemed to have surrounded him in some kind of cocoon. "Toshi," Inko called out in shock, fear and concern. Once the steam started to fade from the cocoon of Toshi's body, the huge wolf was replaced by a little, tiny, cub-sized wolf. Big blue eyes looking up at Inko, looking so darn adorable. Inko couldn't help but stare at him in shock and awe. To be honest, she never knew that familiars could shrink like this, though she knew that they could shrink a little bit, maybe a third of their size to make it easier, since most familiars are either average size animals like cats and dogs. But a giant wolf like Toshi, he shrunk more than half his size, just so he could be small enough for her to carry him. Covering her mouth in shock, trying to keep herself from squealing from how adorable Toshi looked right now. How was it that he could shrink this much and still seem so adorable at the same time? How, was all she could manage to say, unable to even speak before shaking her head and knelt on the floor, sitting on her knees as she placed her hands on her legs, just staring at Toshi. He just looked at her, tilting his head to the side as he gazed at her, as if wondering if she was upset or confused about the whole thing about this. Honestly, Inko didn't really know what to say or do about this, but at the same time, she wasn't mad about this at all. In all honesty, the young woman just wasn't sure how to adjust to this. After all, Inko had been so used to him being so big. Toshi lowered his head, as well as his ears, before looking down at the floor. That had alerted Inko, causing her to frown before carefully lifting Toshi into her arms and set him on her lap. Toshi, of course, looked up at her, ears still lowered as he gazed up at the green-haired woman. "I'm not mad, Toshi. This just surprised me. I've never seen a familiar shrinking their size that much before. Nor on how they do it, since I've never seen it before." His ears perked a little at that. Seemed that had calmed him down a little, making her smile a little. "Okay, let's go have a bath, okay, Toshi? This will make it a lot easier for me to bathe you." His tail started to wag at the idea for that one. Inko giggled a little before lifting her familiar into her arms and started to walk on through the hall. Wanting to make sure that she had Toshi secure in her arms, the young woman hummed softly as she started to think about the kinds of shampoo and conditioner she could use for Toshi. So many choices, though she wondered how long he could stay in this size. Was there a limit? Or was this something that he can hold on to for as long as he wanted to? There was no way of knowing what would or could happen, though she knew that this was just another learning experience. After all, there was still so much that she still had to learn about Toshi and his abilities, even though she had, for the most part, only learned about the one ability for sure. The other, the one involving flames, it made her a little confusing, as she had yet to see that one again. Maybe that was just an illusion. Hard to say, though knew that it couldn't have been. There aren't many demons known to make illusions. Taking a deep breath, the young woman made her way to the little store the college had. It had a nice selection for products that could be used for your familiars, even for demons based on their types, abilities, class, and so on. Though, for the time being, she didn't know much about him before letting out a soft sigh as she wondered what kind of demon Toshi was. He still hasn't told her much of anything, and for the most part, it made her think that maybe he never would open the link. Was there something more that was bothering him? Or was it something else? Letting out a soft sigh, the young woman didn't think that she would get any kind of answers for a while yet. After all, Toshi was only willing to tell 𝗬𝗵𝗲 what his name was, and not much else. Well, that and why he kept the link on his end closed. Once reaching the shampoo, the young woman couldn't help but smile at the selection. Looking down at Toshi, she asked, "Which one do you want?" Toshi tilted his head to the side before squirming a bit in Inko's hold and jump out of her arms before landing on the floor. He would look at the bottles, sniffing at each one before he managed to clamp his little fangs onto the bottle and brought it over to Inko. Sitting down, his tail wagging behind him as he looked up at her with a smile. Well, Inko could only assume it's a smile from the way he was looking at her. Carefully, she took the bottle from him and carefully looked it over. It was definitely good for messy fur like his. It was this jasmine scented? Looking down at him, Inko asked, "You like jasmine?" A little yip was her answer, as well as a wag of his tail. Inko could only giggle at the wolf before carefully picking him up and made her way over to the counter, paid for the shampoo, and started to make her way back. Toshi was cuddled up in Inko's arms, most likely just happy that he could be carried like this. Just how long was he able to stay in this form? If she was honest, she just hoped that he could stay this small long enough to give him a proper bath. Though really, she wasn't sure what she could do. "Are you able to stay in that form, Toshi?" asked Inko with a tilt of her head. The little wolf just peeked up at her and tilted his head back at her, before nodding and gave a happy yip. Inko wanted to squeal at how adorable that was. Yet, before she could even get back to the dorms, someone stepped in her path, glaring down at her with a smirk. "Hello, Inko." Oh, it was the guy that was in her class, talking down to her before 𝗬𝗪𝗏 stepped in. "Is that your familiar?" he asked in surprise. His eyes even showed the shock that he was most likely feeling at the moment. "Wasn't he a lot bigger?" he said in shock, only to start laughing. Inko couldn't help but glare at him. "What do you want?" she asked, tapping her foot as she was in a hurry to get back to her dorm. "I wanted to try to take your familiar myself, but now? I just feel bad for you. He's puny now. What did you do to him? Make him think that he needs to be tiny in order to protect you, or even better? Did you somehow influence him to being smaller than even you?" He mocked as he threw his head back and started to laugh at her. Okay, there was one thing that Inko hated. It was being judged for her height. Yes, she was short. Yes, it had always been a problem for her in order to grab things if it wasn't for her magic, but to be mocked for it, and it somehow influencing her familiar. That was crossing a line, though before she could even say a single word, Toshi started to snarl and growl in her arms, his fur bristling as he gazed at the young man before them. "Aw, the cute little wolf is mad at me. What are you going to do about it?" mocked the young man. Toshi jumped from Inko's arm, steam forming around his body. As he landed, the steam faded, and there was Toshi, his giant wolf body that was even bigger than before. He snarled, flames starting to circle around him as if getting ready to attack. Inko couldn't see his eyes, but she could somehow sense the anger that was flowing through him. As for the young man, he yelped in shock and fear as he fell onto his butt. Toshi took a step toward him, his eyes aglow with his anger. "Call him off," shouted the student. "No." "What?" Inko crossed her arms as she glared at him. "I have done nothing to you since I started at this college, and all you've done is torment and pick on me, and tried to hurt Toshi when Gran Torino and I were bringing him. Then of course insulted me time and again." The young woman wasn't really going to allow Toshi to hurt him. But maybe if he got the hint that she wasn't going to allow him to pick on her anymore, maybe he'll get the hint to leave her alone now. "Just call him off. Not until you apologize." "Okay, I'm sorry. Like you mean it, jerk." Inko glared more at him. Her green eyes even seemed darker than usual, though really this was just a build-up of all the bullying that she had gone through till now. "Fine, I am sorry for being a jerk. I'm sorry for being an ass. Just please call him off," he said, fear lacing his words as Toshi took another step, his jaws snapping, saliva dripping from his fangs as he snarled. "Okay, Toshi, you can stop now," Inko called, though it seemed that Toshi didn't listen. The flames still sparked and flickered around his body. Had he reverted to being feral again? Carefully, Inko made her way toward the wolf and gently ran her fingers through his fur. The wolf blinked. His jaws snapped shut before he turned back toward Inko and tilted his head to the side at her. "It's okay, Toshi, just leave him be. He's just not worth it." Inko gave him a small smile, petting him as she used her magic to calm him down some more. "Now, let's just go and give you a bath, okay?" His tail wagged at that idea. He yipped before steam bellowed from his being before it disappeared, allowing his tiny form to appear and jump into Inko's awaiting arms. She smiled down at Toshi and kissed his forehead. When she gazed down at him, she thought that she could see a faint blush on his cheeks, but as quickly as it had appeared it had disappeared. After that, the young woman started to make her way back toward her room while humming to herself. Yet, as she walked, she couldn't help but think about what had just happened. Toshi had just jumped in without a second thought when she had been talked down too. Though, then again he was also insulting Toshi, so maybe the wolf had felt threatened. Or he wanted to protect Inko. There was no way of knowing what it was that was happening, though she knew that she had to keep Toshi calm. After all, he hadn't listened to her when she tried to call him off, but had calmed down the moment she had came in contact with him, even before her magic came in contact with the wolf. Was there something more to the wolf than she thought But then again, there was so much more to Toshi than anyone could know. After all, he was unknown still to everyone, and hadn't been checked as to what kind of demon he was, other than being able to use flames. Letting out a soft sigh, the young woman looked down at the wolf, who was just snuggling with her. It almost seemed as if he had split personalities, docile and feral. Right now, he was so calm and gentle, and she was able to keep him that way. So there had to be a way for that. There had to be something that was making it that way for him. Was it just her, or her magic altogether? She couldn't really be sure, though honestly, Inko just wondered what kind of power and magic did 𝗬𝗓 even possess at all. There was just no way of knowing what it was, though knew that he would show her at some point. Even if it was by accident, or even on purpose such as during training. Taking a deep breath, the young woman made her way to her room and set 𝗬𝗓 on the bed before getting the bathroom set up for him. Yet, as she looked out to the bedroom from the bathroom, she just couldn't help but allow her thoughts to wander a little before letting out a soft sigh and started to get the tub set up. Honestly, she thought that maybe she would have to talk to 𝗬𝗏 or even 𝗬𝗪. Maybe even get 𝗧𝗵𝗲 to get 𝗧𝗵𝗲 to talk to 𝗬𝗓 again, because just like before, the bond had disappeared from her, so she couldn't sense a single thing from 𝗬𝗓. Letting out a soft sigh, the young woman went on about her day to comfort and spoil 𝗬𝗓 before classes would start the following week. With the weekend over with, Inko couldn't help but wonder what would happen in class now. It had her a little curious as to what she could do with 𝗬𝗓 in class. She still didn't know what his full abilities are, so it had her concerned as to what she was to expect from her familiar. Though, at the same time, it had her curious as to if 𝗬𝗓 was even ready for classes with her, yet since he still had faint traces of his injuries. Yet, so far he seemed like he was feeling a lot better. As they sat in class, 𝗬𝗏 calmly went on his lecture, asking everyone on the type of familiar they had. Everyone of course answered without an issue, though when it came to her, well, Inko just gave in, "I'm not sure yet, I'm sorry." While the teacher was a little more understanding, most of her classmates snickered at her. 𝗬𝗓 of course growled at them, only being able to be calmed till Inko started to pet him. All she knew was that he was a wolf that had not a lot of sanity within him anymore due to something. That was another thing that she wasn't sure about. As there was no way of her knowing what had caused him to lose his sanity, there could be a number of reasons. But the young woman wasn't sure what she could do. There had to be something that she could do to learn more about 𝗬𝗓, but at the same time he still hadn't opened the link for the two of them out of fear of it hurting her. Yet, at the same time, the young woman just didn't know how to go about it. There was something that she could do, just wasn't sure what that was yet. With his end of the bond closed, she couldn't look into his memories or anything of the sort. Though, she had a feeling that she didn't want to since he was known for being feral and attacking killing people and animals, so yeah, not a good idea on that. Then, of course, everyone had trouble with 𝗬𝗓's size alone. He was a rather large wolf, bigger than the other familiars that were in the room. Looking at her familiar, Inko pet him saying, "Can you shrink down please 𝗬𝗓?" "Don't ask him, tell him," shouted one of her classmates. Inko glared at them as she said, "I won't tell him what to do. I'll ask nicely, because he has thoughts and feelings like everyone else. Leave me to how I treat my familiar, and how you treat yours to you." All she could do was glare, before looking back at 𝗬𝗓, watching as the steam had started to fade away. He had shrank down to his adorable tiny-sized form, jumping up onto her lap and curled up into a small ball. Inko just smiled before petting him gently, then went back to what 𝗬𝗏 started to talk about. Going over the books of course this time around, speaking the history of familiars and those with magical abilities. That there were even gods that roamed the earth, speaking, helping, or even blessing humans to help them with their magic. There were good and bad gods, but there was only one bad god who was deemed nameless, because no one alive could recall his name or ever knew his name in the long run. Inko blinked in confusion before looking at the book. They covered more about this nameless god, how powerful he was, and the possible abilities that he had. No one was sure as to what abilities he had, but it was said that he still had followers even now. That the only people who would know his name and what his power was. Yet, as for where their base/church/temple was is still known to all of the world to this day, as only those who were direct descendants would know where he was. 𝗬𝗏 seemed sad as he spoke about this god. Though to the young woman, this god almost seemed like he was some kind of demon rather than a god. Why that was, she wasn't sure, and it had her a little curious as to who this god was in the first place. Suddenly, a new feeling overcame her. It was as if she had some kind of tunnel vision. Everything started to fade for Inko. Sound, sight, touch, every single one of her senses started to fade from her only to be replaced by something else. Her sight, replaced by a field filled with the remains of human bodies, covered in blood, sparks of flames and dirt. Her hearing filled with the remaining people being burned, electrocuted to death, or just being stabbed. The smell that hit her in this, it had hit her hard. It was burning flesh, and it nearly made her gag, her eyes tearing up from how awful it smelled. Looking around, the young woman had found herself standing in a pile of corpses. Well, half of them were dead. Others crying and screaming from pain, wishing for their pain and misery to end. covering her mouth and her vision, or at least that was what she was calling it at this point. Standing in the distance was a shadowy figure, a white smile growing on his face as he looked in her direction. Do you see all of this? All of the people who followed you are no longer around you. No one will help you anymore. They are now my followers. Inko just stared as the tears streamed down her face. A soft grunt was heard next to her, causing her to turn her head to stare at the figure. Though, just like the other shadow, this one was also surrounded by shadows. Yet, this one seemed weak and frail even. He breathed heavily, though his breathing would choke up here and there, as if he struggled to even breathe at all. The second shadow moved his lips, at least from what Inko could see of his white teeth. Yet she couldn't hear anything that he was saying. Yet, the first shadow just laughed like that of a madman before he held a sword in his hand and held onto a human man's throat with his free hand. Your last follower, the one who wouldn't leave your temple. This will serve as a sign to those who would dare even attempt to follow you ever again. Laughing once again, the second shadow looked like he shouted something before trying to rush to save the man, only to fail before falling onto the ground. The cries of the man echoed in her ears before he fell to the ground in a bloodied mess. Inko could only stare in shock as she felt rather sick to her stomach. Covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she tried to force herself to get out of this mindscape. Wanting to get away, wanting to erase this from her mind. But why wasn't she escaping? Why? 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 Why, Inko? Shouted a voice, one that she didn't recognize for the life of her. It seemed panicked, worried, scared. Why scared? What was going on here? Feeling something wet running up her cheek, Inko was rather confused as to what that was. Looking around, toughing her cheek, wondering where it was. Looking ahead, she saw one of the shadows looking at her, eyes staring back at her, though before anything could be said. Inko felt herself being pulled away from this, whatever this place actually was. Her senses started to fade once again, only to be replaced by something more relaxing, comforting from what she could feel. Eyes fluttering open, she found herself in a white room, laying on something soft and very comfortable, almost feathery to the touch. Something fluffy was snuggled against her, gently licking her cheek as if trying to rouse her from a dream. Turning her gaze over, the young woman saw Toshi licking her cheek, his eyes seeming sad, concerned and scared for her. Giving him a small smile, the young woman reached up and gently ran her fingers through the wolf's furry head. He looked up at her, eyes looking worried at her. I'm fine, I don't know what happened though. Inko calmly said with a frown on her face. What was it that she saw? It just didn't make sense to her, though she knew that she had seen such an act for one reason, and one reason only, but just wasn't sure what it could have been, or what was the cause of such a thing in the first place. Inko, called 𝗧𝗵𝗲 as he rushed into the room, 𝗬𝗪𝗏 in tow as they both carried something. 𝗬𝗪𝗏 carrying a bag, looking like clothes, while 𝗧𝗵𝗲 was carrying a tin. Maybe he brought sweets or something. Are you okay? How are you feeling? 𝗧𝗵𝗲 nearly wailed in worry. I'm fine. What happened? Asked 𝗬𝗪𝗏. I don't know. I was listening to Gran Torino when it was like I was having some kind of outer body experience. Seeing something that only I could see, it was horrible. Inko whispered before explaining everything that she had seen in as much detail as she could. Toshi, though, he just seemed concerned as he stared at her, his body still as small as it was when she was in class. Had he been in this form the whole time? Shaking her head a little, the young woman looked up at her friends as she asked, What happened while I was in class? Inko tilted her head to the side as she looked at her friends in confusion. 𝗬𝗪𝗏 let out a soft sigh, using his free hand to rub the back of his neck. Honestly, you looked like you were going to be sick. Toshi here was trying to get you to come around as he kept barking, yipping and so on. Gran Torino tried to help you, but you weren't responding to anyone. 𝗬𝗪𝗏 explained, his eyes still looking as exhausted as ever though. It almost looked as if his eyes had bigger bags than usual. After that, you, puked over yourself and Toshi. She what? Gran Torino carried you to the nurse's station, and recovery girl got you cleaned up and placed you in a gown. Gave Toshi a bath, when he allowed it since he didn't want to leave your side. Frowning, she looked over at Toshi and felt his fur a little more closely. Yeah, his fur still had a bit of dampness to it. How long was I out for? Asked Inko. Couple hours at least. 𝗧𝗪𝗏 answered before sighing softly. Strange that you had such a vision. Whatever it was, we'll have to be careful, but still, to have such a vision that powerful. It had to have been a powerful being that wanted you to see something maybe? 𝗧𝗪𝗏 didn't seem sure by his own hypothesis. but wanted to learn more about this himself as well. Was there anything else, Inko? Asked 𝗬𝗪. I heard a voice calling out to me. I'm not sure who it was though, that's the only thing. Inko whispered softly. Both young men looked at Inko for a brief moment before looking at each other. Then back to Inko. It made her wonder what was going on through their minds right now. Though all she could do was tilt her head at the two of them. It could be possible, 𝗬𝗪 started, making her think as to what it was that he was going to say. That your familiar could have tried calling out to you because of the state that you were in. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 finished, causing her to blink and look over at her familiar who was curled up against her. Was it really him calling out to her, while she was in her state of mind? Tilting her head to the side in confusion, and gently brushed his fur, causing him to look up at her, and blinked his blue-golden eyes at her in confusion. Was it you that spoke to me, Toshi? Were you trying to help me through that vision? She asked, confusion in her green eyes. Yet somehow a little hopeful, wondering if it was him that was trying to speak to her after all. That he was trying to help her in some way. His eyes, though, he avoided eye contact with Inko and tried to shake his head. Body trembling, unsure as to what it was that he could say to her. Though Inko wasn't sure if there was anything that she could say to that. Obviously he had to have been someone that spoke to her. He was avoiding eye contact, trying hard not to tremble as he answered her. No, the wolf had to have spoken to her. He had to have done that. So why else would he try to lie? Frowning all the more, the young woman gently ran her fingers through his fur once again, hoping that would coax him to tell her the truth. Are you sure that you didn't speak to me, Toshi? I know it was the voice of 𝗬𝗪 and 𝗧𝗵𝗲 talking to me, or at least calling out to me. Toshi blinked up at her, and then looked away, ignoring her question, as if he didn't want to speak anymore. Or at least, not want to answer her questions, even with just simple nods or shakes of his head. Inko let out a soft sigh, not sure how she could get him to answer her, though she ran her fingers through his fur once again. Looking up at her friends, she asked, what am I to do? I can't talk to him. He won't talk to me due to him blocking the bond on his end. 𝗧𝗪𝗲 frowned as he crossed his arms in deep thought. He was normally good with coming up with ideas, though there was the odd time that they would blow up in his face. Sometimes literally. Then, he had a big grin on his face before looking over at 𝗬𝗪. Hey 𝗬𝗪, do you think it's possible to enchant the stones that Inko and Toshi have in their hair? To be a limiter for his power? 𝗬𝗪 tiredly looked over at the blonde, as if he was trying to think what it was that the blonde had said to him. Blinking a couple times slowly, the young man looked back at Inko, as if calculating things on his own, wondering what it was that could work, though there was no way of knowing what it was that could help with the two to communicate, but still allow them to keep their own personal thoughts to themselves. It is possible, 𝗬𝗪 mumbled before shrugging his shoulders before looking over at the blonde once again. Inko just frowned a little in confusion. Though, it can have its drawbacks. Such as? Inko asked. Well, you'd feel his emotions easier, know what he's thinking to a certain degree, and of course, sometimes act upon those feelings. If he's mad, for example, and it's powerful enough, you could be rather grouchy, or even want to rip someone's head off. Such as with him being feral. 𝗬𝗪𝗏 mumbled out his theory, which made her just tilt her head over to the side in confusion. That was a good idea, but for her to even react to his emotions should they be strong enough. That was troubling, but knew that she wanted to know what it was that he was thinking. Looking up at her friends, she asked, is there a way to make sure that I don't react to his emotions? Well, I'm in most of your classes. So, if it gets down to it with me being in most of your classes, I could restrain you and Gran Torino could even help you since you are his favorite student. 𝗬𝗪𝗏 answered with a nod to his idea as to what they could do to help. Looking down at Toshi, he was still snuggled up against her and let out a soft sigh. I'll do it. I want to know what he is feeling, such as when he's hurt, angry, and so on. Inko answered, turning her gaze down toward Toshi with a small smile on her face, petting him gently as he just nuzzled against her hand with a soft sigh of content. 𝗬𝗪𝗏 and 𝗧𝗪𝗲 nodded their heads before 𝗬𝗪𝗏 made his way over to Inko. 𝗧𝗪𝗲 made his way toward Toshi. Each of the young men held onto the crystals in Inko's and Toshi's hair. With their free hands, 𝗧𝗪𝗏 and 𝗬𝗪𝗏 held onto the other before both closing their eyes. Mumbling the spell, 𝗬𝗪𝗏 would say part of the spell, and 𝗧𝗪𝗏 would repeat. Their bodies would glow in a bright white light as they spoke. Inko could only watch in shock and awe as their hair floated upward above their heads. She was surprised that 𝗧𝗪𝗏's hair would do that since he had it gelled back so thickly. Once the spell was done, their hair floated back into position, releasing their holds on Inko, Toshi, and each other. Once their hands had released from each other though, Inko felt something hitting her that she knew wasn't hers. Turning her gaze over toward Toshi, she felt a great deal of concern hitting her. Toshi licked at Inko's hand and looked up at her. "Toshi, you are concerned about me?" she asked softly. The wolf would just nod his head before snuggling against her once again and let out a soft sigh. It seemed, though, just knowing that she was okay had brought him some kind of relief. But it still made her a little happy knowing that she was okay. Though, the young woman just hoped that everything would be okay, and that she hadn't bitten off more than she could chew. The new spell for her bond had, for the most part, helped her to understand Toshi a little more. Though, she still didn't hear words, but only felt his emotions more than anything else. Though it still had her worried for Toshi, as she had no idea as to what could be troubling him. Gran Torino had even came to check on her to make sure nothing else had happened since the incident in his class. Sadly, one thing that bothered her the most was that a few students had been tormenting her a little more. Mostly because she had thrown up from that so-called vision that she had that day. That bothered her a great deal. So, as she was sitting outside with her friends, 𝗬𝗪 and 𝗧𝗵𝗲, as well as their familiars, they just sat around before their next class started. "So Inko, how is the spell so far? Have you felt anything influencing your own feelings?" asked 𝗧𝗪𝗲 as he pet 𝗬𝗪𝗲. Looking up at her friends for a moment, before looking back at Toshi, and gave him a small smile. Letting out a soft sigh, the young woman looked up at the blonde before saying, "Well, I just feel a more powerful concern than I would usually feel. So that is something. But other than that, nothing that would put someone in danger or at risk." 𝗬𝗪𝗲 and 𝗧𝗵𝗲 nodded to that. So far, it had seemed that the spell was working for her. At least that was something, though she couldn't help but feel a little curious as to what would happen should Toshi go to his feral nature, even for a moment. Would Inko lose herself to the feeling before she would even have time to even try to protect everyone from her own familiar? Though the raven-haired man just shrugged his shoulders as he said, "If anything, I'm sure you'll be fine. You are a strong woman, Inko." Inko gave her friend a small smile before looking back at Toshi. He seemed rather calm and relaxed. Though, she still didn't know what he would do now. For the most part, he was healed and able to move around without any restricted movement. So that was something for the most part. Though from what she could sense from him so far, he was plotting something. What it was, she didn't know, and it almost had her worried. "Toshi, are you okay?" asked Inko. The wolf blinked his golden blue eyes up at her and tilted his head a little at her. Confusion was being sent her way through the bond, making her wonder if he was playing cute at this point. "You aren't planning something, are you?" she asked with a raised brow. Toshi shook his head at her before laying his head back on his paws. Now she knew he was trying to hide something from her. Though she had to think of a way to get him to tell her what it was that he had in mind as a form of evil plan he was plotting. Though it wasn't like she could get him to tell her what it was. The bond could force him to tell her the truth, to make him do as she wanted, but it's wrong to force them to do what you want. Inko thought to herself with a soft sigh before looking away from the wolf and back to her friends. Looking between Kazumi and Usagi, she saw that neither 𝗧𝗪𝗲 or 𝗬𝗪𝗏 were forcing their familiars to do what they wanted, at least for the most part, with slight scolding here and there from what she herself had witnessed with her friends and their familiars. The mere thought of forcing a familiar to do something, regardless if they are your familiar or not, it sickens her to the point that she nearly wanted to puke. Toshi let out a little yip, causing her to look at the black wolf. His ears drooped down at the sides of his head, and he nuzzled Inko's side, as if hoping to comfort her. Giving him a small smile as she said, "I'm okay, Toshi, don't worry about a thing." She gave him a big smile, hoping that would be enough to calm him down. Letting out a soft sigh, the young woman pet Toshi, hoping that would be enough to calm him down some more. Knowing that Toshi was most likely reacting to the emotions that he felt from her at this point, since the bond on her end was still open, so he could easily feel her for the most part, most likely. Taking a deep breath, the young woman looked up at the sky, wondering if there was anything more to that vision that she had the other day. It still seemed so strange that she would even have such a vision. Maybe there were some books about a great battle. "Hey 𝗬𝗪𝗏, can you do me a favor? If you bring me more cat cookies, sure." 𝗬𝗪𝗏 mumbled tiredly. Inko just rolled her eyes a little but giggled. Toshi just blinked up at her in confusion, almost as if curious as to what it was that she was going to ask of 𝗬𝗪𝗏. The green-haired woman calmly asked, "Think you could look into battles from long ago? I know my vision was about some kind of great war involving some kind of demon, maybe followers or something along those lines." 𝗬𝗪𝗏 just seemed to blink at her in confusion. He blinked once, twice, thrice. "Why do you want to know about the vision? Inko, for all we know, it was just someone messing with you." 𝗬𝗪𝗏 mumbled before nibbling on one of his snacks. Inko figured that there was something going on about that. Though, at the same time, the one figure in the vision looked straight at her. She knew that much. But there had to be more to it than that. Just had to be. Though what was it is the problem. 𝗬𝗪𝗧𝗧 just rolled his eyes at her before sighing. Fine, I'll look some stuff up, but 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗍 is helping me. To do that kind of research with so little idea on what to look for is going to be a pain. The raven-haired man said with a small, mock glare before turning to the blonde. 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗍's reaction. His face was bright red with what Inko could only describe as hearts in his eyes. Though 𝗬𝗪𝗧𝗧 just blankly stared at him, as if trying to think on what was wrong with the man. Inko looked between the two of them before tilting her head at the two men. It was obvious that 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗍 liked 𝗬𝗪𝗧. Anyone with a brain could see that, yet 𝗬𝗪𝗧 was either ignoring the feelings clearly shown, or he was just that oblivious to the whole thing. 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗍? Inko called out to the blonde, though he didn't seem to respond. His face is still red, eyes still shining and sparkling as he gazed at the raven-haired man. Is he even breathing? Asked Inko with a frown on her face. I'm not sure, 𝗬𝗪𝗧𝗍 said with a tilt of his head before he slowly reached out with his hand, poking 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗍's chest. The blonde fell over quiet easily. Oh my god, is he dead? Shouted Inko. No, little one is just in shock. He would love to help you in your quest, Inko dear. I'll remind him later on though. If you wish for him to wake up faster, then water on his face will awaken little one. Kazumi said with a kind smile on her face. Nodding her head, Inko used her magic to grab a cup that was laying around by the group. Moved it over toward the pond and scooped up some water before lifting it back to 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗍. Splashing the entire cup of water onto the blonde's face, he sputtered in shock before sitting up. A big grin on his face, as he stood up quickly as he yelled out, of course, I'll help you, 𝗬𝗪𝗧𝗍. Everyone in the courtyard covered their ears. As they made their way to class, Inko and Toshi had gone to a class about training with your familiar and their abilities. It is mostly as a means of learning of their abilities, rather than the types of powers. For example, most demons, regardless if they are the same race, they could still have one different power. But, regardless, their powers and or abilities could still be very different at the same time. Which made the class very important. A few students were a little nervous trying to get their familiars to use their abilities. Though it still made her a little curious as to what Toshi could do himself. The only thing that she knew about was that he could shrink himself down before returning to normal size. Then of course, the whole fire thing that he can do, though, that was something that she had yet to see him doing. Some of the familiars can use fire, some can shape shift, and others can even use fire and so on. Yet when they got to Toshi, Inko was a little nervous as she gazed down at the wolf as he just looked up at her, as if asking for permission to use his power. So, Miss Midoriya, what kind of power does your familiar have? Asked the teacher. I'm not really sure myself. I just got Toshi here and I'm not sure what he can do other than shrink. His other power I've only seen when he's angry. Interesting, the teacher said before looking down at the wolf before looking back at Inko. Can you ask him to display one of his powers? Inko looked over at Toshi and frowned a little at him, wondering if he would even show his powers to her in the first place. Toshi, can you show us an ability? The wolf blinked a little at Inko before looking up at the teacher and tilted his head at the teacher. It seemed as if he was debating whether or not if he should show any of his powers. It made the young woman worry for her, thinking that this was the first sign of him rejecting her as his witch. Then, Toshi nodded his head before looking at the teacher, lifting his paw as if asking him to back up a bit. The teacher, of course, frowned a little at that, but did as the wolf asked, or at the very least requested. Toshi's eyes glowed a bright gold mixed with the darkest of blues. The aura around the teacher seemed to have formed some kind of cloud of energy around him. The teacher seemed confused, but it all happened in seconds. But really it almost felt like minutes. The teacher's energy soon shot out and started to create a body of water before it started to surround him. The teacher started to panic and started to claw at the water, as if trying to get himself to break free. What the hell was going on? Looking down at Toshi, Inko saw that he was laying down on the ground, as if nothing was happening. Toshi, stop that now, he can't breathe. Toshi just blinked up at her, yet he was still as calm as ever. He gave her a look as if telling her to wait and watch. And it was then that Inko saw the water disappear, and the teacher falling to the ground, breathing in deeply. His eyes wide and fearful, having witnessed something terrible, and it made Inko wonder what had happened. Mr. Akira? The man looked up. His graying hair almost seemed to have grown white in that moment. His goatee almost seemed to have thinned out on her before shaking her head. His body was trembling before he shook his head and looked up at Inko and the wolf. I can't believe it. He has fear illusion. What? The entire class stated. Fear illusion is an ability that is very hard to master, and almost no demon possesses such an ability. It's as powerful as it is rare. Inko blinked in confusion. It can create anyone's worst fear into reality, or at least as close to reality as it can. I almost felt like I was drowning and couldn't escape. It only lasts so long as the user doesn't put much magic in it, he calmly said before turning to Inko. His narrowed eyes almost seemed gleeful at the idea of this power, and it only made her nervous thinking such a thing. He nodded his head before looking over at Inko as he calmly said, "Where did you find such a creature as this one?" Inko couldn't really lie. Almost everyone here knew where she got Toshi. And if the teacher knew that she was lying, then he would want to try to do something terrible to Toshi. He didn't deserve that. Unless I found him. He was badly wounded, so I brought him here, and he just seemed to have attached himself to me right away. Well, that was a half-truth anyway. No need to go into the whole story. Interesting, he whispered before grinning. That grin made Inko all the more nervous before he started to chuckle. I'll have to look up on what kind of demon he is. Do you know what he is at all, Miss Midoriya? No, he is actually still unknown to me and everyone else so far. Though we're learning slowly to know what Toshi is. She gave the wolf a smile on her face. The wolf just wagged his tail and yipped up at her, nuzzling Inko's side as he let out a soft growl of contentment. It made her smile that her familiar was so cuddly. It was just so damn cute that he would do such a thing like this, even though he had displayed such a powerful yet fearful ability. In more ways than one. Though it still had her curious as to what more the wolf could do. Shrinking, and your worst fears. It made her wonder what kind of demon he truly was. Though knew that for now they had more work that they had to do in order to learn what Toshi was. But that would take time, and who knows how much time it would be till he reveals all of his powers to her. As for the rest of the class itself, everyone was still curious about the power that Inko's familiar demonstrated, but there wasn't much that they could do now. All they could do was focus on their own familiars. Looking at the wolf, who was just relaxing on the floor once again, Inko couldn't help but just really stare at him. He didn't use much magic, because he didn't want the teacher to suffer long, because he only asked him to use the spell, or at least to show one of his magical abilities. It just made her puzzled. Was that his least powerful attack, or was it the most powerful in his arsenal? Hey, did you know Toshi could do that? Asked 𝗬𝗪 with confusion in his dark eyes. When did he get over here? Inko thought to herself before looking at her friend. I didn't know at all, really. 𝗬𝗪 stared at Inko, as if he was trying to read her, to see if she was lying to him or not. Only for him to let out a sigh. I guess that makes sense. He's been healing, so it would be rather difficult for him to show you any of his abilities. Though makes me wonder just how powerful he really is, said the raven-haired young man before looking at the wolf, who now was looking at Usagi with a tilt of his head. Usagi just blinked as she stared at the wolf, as if the two of them were having some kind of staring contest that no one would be aware of who won. No matter if someone blinked or not. They just stared at each other. Wonder what Usagi is trying to say to him, 𝗬𝗪 mumbled. What do you mean? Asked Inko. It made her wonder how anyone could have such a great bond with their familiar, making her think if she and Toshi would ever have a bond like that at some point. At least, when he was ready to talk to her, to speak to her in some other fashion than how he has been so far. The idea itself, it would be nice to be able to speak to Toshi, though knew that right now he was still keeping the bond to himself for the time being. Not sure what she could do to help him, but she knew one thing, that she would do whatever it took to make sure that he was happy and safe from whatever would want to hurt him now. Though, at the same time, it still made her wonder who had even hurt him in the first place to have been in such a shape. Turning her gaze to look down at the wolf in question, she saw that he wasn't there anymore. Eyes widening, the young woman looked around the room. not sure where he could have gone, though she knew that she had to find him and fast. "Toshi, where are you?" Inko was running around, trying to find her familiar. Not sure where he was. There was no telling what he would do. Looking around, the young woman tried to do whatever she could to find him. As she ran, the young woman ran into one of her friends. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 yelped in shock before grabbing a hold of Inko's arms to steady her. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 blinked his green eyes before saying, "Okay, just calm down, okay? Focus on your bond with him. I'm sure it'll lead you to Toshi without any issues." Inko frowned all the more before trying to calm herself down, though it was harder for her to calm down. The bond was hard for her to focus on, thinking that Toshi had somehow returned to being a feral demon, until she remembered that if that had happened, then she would have reflected upon it, unless there is some kind of loophole in such a thing. Yet, as she was able to calm herself down enough, the young woman hadn't been able to locate Toshi at all. It was starting to concern her, making her think that something had happened to him, or that he had just vanished without a trace of some kind. Eyes widening, she started to cover her mouth to keep herself from crying out in fear and concern for the wolf. "Okay, we'll just start to look around. I'm sure that if you're close enough that you'll sense him. Toshi may be able to sense you, or maybe he's blocking himself or you this time around. I thought the spell wouldn't allow that," Inko pointed out. "He may have found some kind of loophole of some kind," 𝗧𝗵𝗲 said with a sigh before running a hand through his hair and looked back down toward Inko. Without thinking, he grabbed a hold of her hand and started to walk with her to look for the missing familiar. It was going to be a little difficult for them to find a wolf, with Toshi's ability to shrink himself down to size and whatnot, though there was still so much more to the wolf that they didn't know about yet. They started to go anywhere that a wolf would be attracted to, mostly the courtyard and the cafeteria. There was no sign of the wolf. It only made Inko all the more concerned for the wolf, thinking that he just up and left without wanting to say anything to her. Though, at the same time, it still didn't tell her how he was able to break free of the bond in the first place. There was no telling what he would be doing right about now. Only that he could be causing some kind of mischief, and that only had her all the more concerned. He wasn't stupid, he was intelligent. Or at least smarter than the average animal, having his own thoughts and feelings about everything that was around him. But Inko also wasn't sure what he could be thinking, unless it had something to do with that plot that he was thinking about earlier. "Wait," Inko began, causing 𝗧𝗵𝗲 to stop dead in his tracks, turning to Inko as he wondered what it was that she was going to say. "I remember Toshi plotting something. I don't know what it was, but I know for who. The same guy that's tormented me since school started. Because I didn't have a familiar," Inko pointed out, causing 𝗧𝗵𝗲 to stare in concern. "The last time I encountered him was when he insulted Toshi as well as myself. I had to call Toshi off when he apologized for his behavior though. I think Toshi wasn't done yet. I think he wanted his own revenge of some kind. That would make sense," 𝗧𝗵𝗲 said with a frown before running a hand through his hair. "Wolves tend to be rather protective of their pack. Kazumi has always been protective of my family for generations. Ever since she was with my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather," 𝗧𝗵𝗲 explained before looking at the green-haired woman who now stared at him with wide eyes. If anything, that guy's words were empty and hollow to Toshi. So, he may went after him to make him know what would happen should he torment you again. Eyes now filled with fear, the young woman ran looking for her bully in order to stop Toshi from doing something drastic. There was no telling what he would do, and she didn't want to take that chance on what the wolf would do to him. Gulping in fear, the young woman and 𝗧𝗵𝗲 ran around, trying to find where her familiar had or could have gone to. There was no telling what would happen to him. As they searched, the two young adults heard a few students mumbling to themselves before running toward the courtyard. Inko and 𝗧𝗵𝗲 made their way toward the courtyard, thinking that maybe Toshi had managed to find him, and started to attack. Had he gone feral again? No, if that was the case, then Inko herself would have felt that, wouldn't she? Unless it was something else. She just wasn't sure what it was, though knew that she had to hurry up as quickly as her little legs would carry her. The moment they arrived though, Inko had to say that she had never expected such a thing to even be a thing. For there stood her bully, literally punching himself and biting himself. "What the?" Inko said in shock. Then she saw that he had some food stains on his shirt and pants as well. Something that a sloppy eater would do if they didn't care about where their food went so long as it still made it to their mouth. Yet, there was something off about him. Something that made her think that something was wrong with him. He kept biting and punching himself, most likely leaving bruises on himself. Even a few bite marks on his skin. That had Inko a little concerned about this. Those looked too big to be from a normal-sized dog, though were huge, compared to a wolf. But what made them all the stranger? They didn't bleed. They looked fresh by the red marks around his bite marks. The young man snarled a little like that of a wild animal before. He threw another punch against his own face, making him nearly stumble and fall onto the ground. Almost, he still stood, breathing heavily, as if he was struggling with something. Inko for a brief moment saw his eyes. His deep, blue eyes surrounded by gold. Just like 𝗬𝗓𝗄, Inko called out. The young man froze in his actions. The young man slowly turned his gaze toward Inko, eyes wide and filled with shock, before he seemed to look away in guilt, shame, and remorse. But then it disappeared. Just anger took its place. Not at her, but still toward someone who could very well not be here at the moment. 𝗬𝗓𝗄, come on, what are you doing? How did you? He hurt you, the young man said, shaking his head as he gazed at Inko. Eyes still angry, but at the same time, struggling to fight with his own conscience. His apology was empty. Not sorry, wanted to keep hurting you. Inko couldn't help but frown at the wolf-possessed man. She had no idea how to really think of this in the first place. Taking a careful step toward him, the young woman held up her hands, hoping that 𝗬𝗓𝗄 was calm enough to understand that she wasn't going to hurt him. Right now. Giving him a small yet gentle smile, the young woman calmly said, 𝗬𝗓𝗄, just because he's an awful person doesn't mean that it's right to punish him. He growled a little, though again not at her. He is bad man, 𝗬𝗓𝗄 managed to get himself to say, snarling here and there. The wolf shook his head, now digging his nails into his head, as if trying to stay in control over the body that he possessed. Wants to hurt you more, 𝗬𝗓𝗄 managed to say. It seemed that the control that he had was starting to fade for the time being. Was he only able to keep control for a certain amount of time, or was the bully starting to gain control back? Without thinking, Inko made her way toward 𝗬𝗓𝗄, getting as close as she could. He held his now shaky hand out with a trembling breath. Stay back, he mumbled, trying to regain composure before the young man hunched forward. Arms now wrapped around his stomach as he opened his mouth, most likely trying to throw up whatever contents was in his stomach. A glob came out of his mouth all right. It was a black glob that almost looked like it was some kind of solid slime, but at the same time had wisps surrounding it, making it appear almost ghostly. The moment it hit the ground, it started to shift itself into 𝗬𝗓𝗄's body. He just laid on the ground, breathing deeply, and groaned a little. Without thinking, the young woman rushed over toward 𝗬𝗓𝗄 and checked him over. Honestly, it scared her knowing that he could control someone like that. But at the moment, she was more worried about his well-being more than anything else. He was breathing heavily still. There was no way of knowing what this had done to his body, though she wondered if maybe he had just pushed himself too roughly. Turning her gaze over to the bully, she saw that the bully had fallen over onto his side, eyes wide and white, as if he was still unconscious from whatever it was that 𝗬𝗓𝗄 had done to him. It had her curious, but at the same time she wanted to careless about him after everything that had happened. Looking up at one of the students, she saw 𝗧𝗵𝗲 and said, "Go get recovery girl. I'll tend to 𝗬𝗓𝗄." The blonde nodded his head and ran toward the building to get the healer. As for Inko, she just looked down at the wolf. 𝗬𝗓𝗄 appeared to be sleeping, seeming to be in some kind of pain, or at least discomfort for the most part. Running her fingers through his fur, the young woman couldn't help but be a little curious as to what was going on through his head. Yet, she started to feel him again. He was still angry, though not as hotly as before. If anything, he just felt rather exhausted, more so than ever before. Inko sighed softly, feeling bad for 𝗬𝗓𝗄. Though if he could possess someone, then did that have to do with what he was? Or was it just some kind of strange, rare ability that he possessed? There was no telling what he could do, or what he was possible of doing, and she knew that she had to try to learn more about her familiar. Laying her head against his, the young woman kissed his forehead as she tried to think on what it was that he would be thinking of now. Though, maybe for the time being, she should just try to get Toshi to be comfortable. Once he had relaxed, then she would ask him why he did what he did. Inko couldn't help but look at Toshi as he laid in the bed. After having been checked over, Recovery Girl said that Toshi had merely exhausted himself, therefore, just needs to rest. Though, she had drawn some of his blood, as well as used a spell to get some of the energy of his spirit to try to figure out what kind of demon he was. Possession. Not as rare, but rather uncommon for a demon who hadn't shown any capability of becoming transparent. It baffled Inko still that he was able to do such a thing. The young woman looked over at the wolf, who was just sleeping peacefully on the bed. Breathing in and out, his body seemed relaxed to her. Yet, his body still hadn't returned to its bigger, natural size, but maybe he was just too exhausted to shift back maybe. Reaching out, gently the young woman ran her fingers through his blonde locks that rested atop of his head, making her wonder what was he dreaming of. There were endless possibilities over what he could be dreaming of. Turning back toward the door for a brief moment, wondering where Recovery Girl was. Then her gaze went over to the student, the victim that Toshi had possessed. He was also still asleep, just resting, most likely trying to regain his own strength after what had happened to him. Shaking her head, the young woman looked back over to Toshi and couldn't help but stare at him in concern. Wondering if he was okay, if he was even recovering properly. There was so many things that would go through her head. Wondering what was going on within his own mind. His dreams. There was just no way of her knowing what he was seeing. It wasn't like she could easily see into his dreams, right? Yawning softly, the young woman leaned forward onto the bed, just staring at Toshi as he slept. He really did look so peaceful. It was rather cute and made her want to cuddle up with him. But even though he wasn't in his full size, he still took up the whole bed, leaving little room for even her to cuddle in the bed, just to comfort him even better. Laying her head on the edge of the couch, the young woman couldn't help but feel sleep tugging at her mind. All of the running around and worry that she had earlier. Just trying to even find him, trying to stop him from hurting anyone more than he already had. Before she knew it, she had fallen asleep. Inko frowned as she found herself in a forest. It was a forest that she had never seen before, making her wonder where this was. Was this just some weird dream, or was it like before? Shaking her head, the young woman wandered around a little more, thinking that she could find some way to learn of her whereabouts. Though, if she was honest, Inko highly doubted that would ever be even possible. Taking a deep breath, the young woman kept on looking around, trying to get a feel for her surroundings, though she couldn't be sure as to where she could be or anything of the sort. Maybe if she could get some kind of help to locate this. Maybe even 𝗬𝗪 would be able to help her find this place. Soon, coughing and wheezing reached her ears. Whipping her head around, the young woman tried to find the source of the sound, unsure as to where it came from. Looking around, finding it rather pleasant that she is at least able to move around now compared to the last dream vision that she had. Shaking her head, the young woman could still hear the gasping, wheezing, and pain-filled breaths of air. It just sounded painful to even hear from anyone in the long run. Searching through the forest, following the sounds of wheezing breaths, Inko couldn't help but frown in concern, thinking that maybe this dream was going to make it impossible to find whoever it was. Before she could even five up the search, though, the young woman couldn't help but stop dead in her tracks. There was a stream that almost seemed to shine like beautiful sapphire, sparkling like diamonds. How it still worked for that, she wasn't sure, but really, it was the best way Inko could best describe it. Eyes sparkling at the beauty of it all, she couldn't help but wonder where this place truly was. Yet she noticed that the thing that truly made the stream sparkly wasn't just the natural beauty, but something dripping into it. Green orbs widening. The young woman couldn't help but stare at the stream as she noticed a thick golden liquid dripping steadily into the stream. Following the golden drip, she saw that it led to a body. Though she could make out a muscular figure, she couldn't see his face. It was heavily shaded by the tree, hiding all but his pain-filled eyes from her view. He gasped out from pain. Wounds covered his chest, arms, legs, as well as what she could see from his face as golden liquid dripped down his skin. Was that his blood? What could possess golden blood? That just didn't make sense to her. Though then again, does anything else ever make sense to her? The man gripped at his chest, wheezing what little breath he could draw into his lungs. How did this happen? What happened to him? Eyes widening in concern, she wanted to help him, wanted to tend to his injuries, but she wouldn't be able to do anything while in this realm of hers. I can't die like this, the man said with a gasping breath. Inko couldn't help but stare at him in concern. Losing everything, to him of all people. I can never lose to him again. He breathed once more, tilting his head back as he looked up toward the sky. The young woman could have sworn that she saw a tear roll down his cheeks. So many people I had let down, he whispered weakly. The young woman couldn't help but feel her heart go out to him. How did this happen? Why couldn't she find out? How could she even find out at all? He took a deep, shuddering breath. Inko noticed his body starting to shimmer, a golden light starting to surround him. Inko blinked as he lifted his one hand and gazed at it, letting out a small snarl as he whispered, I won't let this happen. I won't die here. I have to find a way to live. Then, Inko saw his hand slowly lowering, eyes slowly closing as he tried to fight the grip of death trying to grab hold over him. The young woman knew there was nothing that he could do to stop this. His injuries, the way he breathed, blood most likely filling his lungs, drowning him in the process. Before another word was said, his body seemed to have vanished, causing Inko to cry out for him, as if hoping that she could somehow bring him back. Groaning, Inko felt something shaking her shoulder. Eyes fluttering, she slowly started to look around, noticing that someone was trying to wake her up from her nap. "𝗬𝗬𝗄?" she whispered softly before sitting up. Inko looked around the room, remembering that she was still in the infirmary with Toshi. Turning her gaze toward him, the young woman smiled and saw that he was still asleep. Resting was what he needed right now. Her gaze then fell onto the one shaking her. Recovery Girl had a small smile on her face before chuckling and grabbed a chair. "Inko dear, you must have been tired. Worrying for Toshi must have worn me out," Inko calmly answered before rubbing at her face, turning her full attention back onto the older woman and frowned a little. Just a little nervous about what was going on. "Did you find anything about Toshi? Is he okay? What happened?" Recovery Girl took a deep breath before looking toward the wolf in question. "He's a hybrid for sure. He's an Inugami and an Okiryu. It is rather amazing that he is either or and still look like a wolf rather than a dog," Recovery Girl whispered before shaking her head and looked up at the young woman before her. "His display of possession is rather weak and frail. Most likely from lack of use. There is no telling if he's ever used it before today because he's scared, or because he just never had a reason before today. That's why he's so exhausted, because he lacks the training for it," Inko asked. The older woman nodded her head before letting out a soft sigh. "Yes, though now tell me, do you know why he did what he did?" Inko sighed and told Recovery Girl what she knew. What Toshi had told her. Him not believing the words of her bully. That he was sorry for all that he's done to her. Though really, there was no way of knowing if he had meant it or not at the time. But Inko had also mentioned that Toshi was trying to protect her. At least, that was how it felt to her at the time. Now, she wasn't sure. The older woman sighed softly and rubbed her forehead before pushing herself up onto her feet and made her way over toward the shelf. I want you to give him these herbs. Mix them into a tea and give them to him. It'll help his strength since he doesn't have much to do in healing from his injuries. A few days and he'll be healed. Inko blinked in shock. But they will mostly help build up the strength he'll need to use his powers. Train him with the possession. There could be a use to this, but we'll have to figure it out. Inko blinked and nodded her head slowly. It was rather strange that anyone could even think of possession would ever be useful. But would she ever use it in the long run? Or even at all? To be honest, she highly doubted it, though knew that she would have to make sure that Toshi knew never to do it again if he was going to do that much harm to someone like that. Regardless if it was a bully or not. It was still wrong. Nothing could ever fix that, but she still cared about that wolf, even if he did scare her a little now. What was she to do? Recovery Girl let out another chuckle before saying, Inko, do not be afraid of him, dear. A familiar's job is to care and protect their witch or wizard. Blinking her green eyes up at him, the young woman was trying to understand what it was that the older woman was trying to tell her. They will do what they can to keep us safe, no matter what the cost would be to their own health or safety. Toshi is merely displaying what he is capable of doing. Inko lowered her gaze for a moment before turning back to stare at her wolf once again. Toshi still seemed peaceful, a soft snore escaping him here and there. It made the green-haired woman smile gently at the wolf, though she just couldn't really be sure what more he was capable of now. There was still so much that she didn't know, even though they had indeed learned something at the very least. Nodding her head, Inko calmly said, I just hope that I can learn all there is of Toshi, and that someday he'll be able to speak to me. He should be soon. After all, you are able to feel him from what your friend has told me. Once he has fully recovered, he may end up speaking to you. Now, the moment he wakes up, you will need to brew some of that tea and give him some. He should be fine after that, though it will take a couple days of the tea to get his strength up all right. Yes, thank you, Recovery Girl. I just hope that someday Toshi will trust me enough to speak to me. With that, Inko accepted the herbs and smiled at the older woman before turning her gaze back to the sleeping wolf, who hadn't been aware of their conversation at all. Inko slept peacefully in her bed, just enjoying her time away from classes, people, well, everything that was expected in her life in general, though. There was one thing that seemed to confound her in the long run. Inko. That confused Inko a great deal. Who would be talking to her? Also, who the heck would be in her room right now anyway? It just didn't make sense to her, though she tried to ignore it, just wanting to cuddle up in her bed a little more. Curling up under the blankets of her bed, the young woman tried to go back to sleep. Inko, came the voice, sounding a little confused and concerned at the same time. Sleep, was Inko's reply, rather tired. Later today, she was going to meet 𝗬𝗪 in the library about those visions that she has had so far. It confused her a great deal, and it made her a little confused as to what it was about. Letting out a soft sigh, the young woman rolled over in her bed, trying to get herself comfortable. Inko, up, the voice nearly demanded. Before she could even say anything, she felt her blanket being forcefully tugged away from her. Before Inko could even reach over to grab her blanket, the young woman groaned and opened her eyes, only to blink slowly where she saw Toshi now sitting on the floor by her bed, blanket in his mouth. Toshi, what are you doing? Asked Inko. No waking, force waking. Inko blinked in shock as she stared at her familiar. Did he really just speak to her without possessing someone this time? Did he really speak to her with their bond rather than when he took control over a student's body the other day? That didn't make sense to her, but at the same time, she was so grateful hearing his voice, though it was a little broken sounding right now. "Toshi, you're talking," Inko nearly cried. Toshi looked away shyly. "Hard to speak, sorry." Inko couldn't help but give him a gentle smile before running a hand through his blonde locks that resided atop of his head, wanting to assure him that everything was okay. The wolf looked back up at her and blinked his eyes at her, unsure as to what he was to do or say at this point. It seemed that her reaction to his newfound speech, broken as it was, didn't bother her. Only that he was finally speaking to her, at long last. Though it did concern her that he wasn't able to speak properly yet, but she'll deal with that later. Right now, he was speaking to her, and that was what made her happy for the time being. Giggling happily, the young woman pushed herself out of bed, grabbed some clean clothes, and went to have a shower. Though to be honest, she wondered if there was any development with 𝗧𝗵𝗲 and 𝗬𝗪𝙀𝗺. So many ideas went through her head about those two, such as them just talking, and 𝗧𝗵𝗲 makes the first move. 𝗬𝗪𝙀𝗺 gets up, trips over himself, such as tripping over his scarf, a chair leg, and so on, in the process knocking 𝗧𝗵𝗲 over, and they end up kissing, which turn into full-blown make-out session. Though at the same time, she couldn't be sure as to what it was that would happen. So many ideas, yet those were the main ones that came to mind. That was simple enough for the time being. Taking a deep breath, the young woman finished her shower and made her way toward her bedroom and putting her dirty clothes in the hamper before grabbing a tin of cookies that she had baked as usual. Then, of course, had some of them in the shape of musical notes due to 𝗧𝗵𝗲's specialized magic abilities. Looking over at Toshi, she calmly said, "Come on, Toshi. I bet Kazumi and Usagi would love to talk to you." Toshi, in response, mostly walked a little closer to her, pressing his head against her leg. Inko giggled and pet him gently as she said, "Don't worry, Toshi. Everything will be fine." She giggled happily before walking out of her dorm room and locked up behind her and Toshi. The wolf still seemed nervous, though she couldn't help but wonder what was wrong with him. He was never this worried about something. Though maybe it was because he thought she was upset about his broken-up Japanese. Shaking her head slightly, the young woman made her way toward the library, hoping that she hadn't missed her friends. She had to admit, if Toshi hadn't woken her up when he did, then she would have most likely missed out on what her friends would have done. "Be okay?" Toshi called out suddenly, causing Inko to look down and blink down at the wolf. Inko didn't know what he was talking about, though figured that maybe it was about what would happen in the library. Giving him a small smile, the young woman rubbed his ear gently. "Everything will be okay, I'm sure of it, Toshi. You just need to relax is all." Toshi seemed as if he wanted to do anything, but there was still something that had him a little unnerved, but she couldn't put her finger on as to why. Why would he be nervous in the first place? It may end up being one more piece to the never-ending puzzle. Taking a deep breath, the young woman arrived at the library as she looked around, wondering if the guys were even still here in the first place. Frowning, she couldn't help but wonder where they were. Maybe they had gone out for lunch or something. Before she could even say anything, something grabbed her shoulder, nearly causing her to jump out of her skin. Turning around, Inko saw 𝗬𝗪𝙀𝗺 looking down at her. Though the smile, it wasn't like his usual wide grin that would creep people out. More like it was a cat-like grin. "Usagi, what has 𝗬𝗪𝙀𝗺 told you about scaring people like that?" asked Inko with a glare. Usagi giggled a little before shifting back into her cat form and curled up around Inko's shoulders for a moment. 𝗬𝗪 and 𝗧𝗵𝗲 are waiting for you in the back of the library. He sent me to go looking for you, thinking you just slept in like you usually do. Usagi then leapt off of Inko's shoulders and started to lead the young woman and the wolf toward the back. Toshi, though, was a little nervous but didn't seem to voice his concerns much yet. Maybe he wanted to make sure that it was safe for her around here. Reaching over, the young woman rubbed the wolf's ear in the hopes of calming him down, though she wasn't sure what she could keep him calm during the whole thing. Though, maybe she could get them to give her information on Toshi's possession power as well. Upon arriving, Inko saw 𝗧𝗵𝗲 leaning rather closely to 𝗬𝗪, while 𝗬𝗪 was trying to read one of the many books that sat upon the table that they occupied at the moment. 𝗬𝗪, though, grumbled something about 𝗧𝗵𝗲 being far too close for his comfort. Inko just rolled her eyes before taking a seat at the table with her friends. Toshi just curled up as best as he could under the table with Kazumi, who was also curled up asleep by 𝗧𝗪𝗲's feet. Usagi, on the other hand, just curled up around 𝗬𝗪's neck like usual, hiding herself within his scarf to get herself comfortable. "So, did you guys find anything?" asked Inko. "Well, from what other information that you had given us, the visions you seem to be having is about some kind of god, or at least a deity." 𝗬𝗪 mumbled before rubbing the bridge of his nose in annoyance. Sadly, there wasn't much mention of a war, of a battle that killed thousands, or at least not one that can be narrowed down. Inko couldn't help but frown a little at that. That was not something that she was expecting, though. Maybe there was something more to it than what they were thinking about. 𝗬𝗪 just sighed softly before looking out toward Inko, holding out his hands and wiggling his fingers a little at her. "Oh," Inko said before sliding the tin of cat-shaped cookies toward him, then handing the other tin of music-shaped cookies toward 𝗧𝗵𝗲. Both young men started to nibble on their cookies. "So, was there anything about maybe any god or deity that had or could have disappeared?" Inko suggested. Maybe. I think," 𝗬𝗪 hummed in deep thought as he was trying to go over his own knowledge of gods. If Inko remembered right, he had a near-perfect photographic memory. He could remember things, yes, but he sometimes needed something to trigger this memory, or have to go over something once again. Even just a few phrases would be enough to set off his memory storm, as he likes to call it. "I think I remember something about a deity or god that disappeared long ago. I'm just not sure how long ago or what their name was. I'll have to go back to some old books that my family have. I'll have to ask my father if he has some old texts about forgotten gods or anything like that." 𝗬𝗪 mumbled before letting out a soft sigh and groaned a little in confusion as well as frustration. "Wait, Kazumi, don't you know of some gods as well that have disappeared?" asked 𝗧𝗵𝗲 as he looked down at his familiar. Kazumi yawned softly as she said, "I have met many gods in my time, little one, but I cannot keep track of all of them. I know that many of them have their own temples, so your best bet is to see some old temples that have fallen into ruin." The white wolf looked up at them with a tired-like expression before curling back up by the blonde's feet and went back to sleep. "Yeah, that may be the best option. You may have to ask Gran Torino if he'll allow some kind of field trip for it. Just tell him that you want to see old, ruined temples," Usagi suggested with a small shrug of her tiny shoulders. Inko couldn't help but frown a little at that. All of their familiars were suggesting something but Toshi. Looking down at him, she saw that he was sleeping. Maybe having been feral for decades, he has no knowledge of temples and the like. There was no telling what was going on in his head right now, and it had her a little confused. But maybe she should ask him about it later. Right now, he was tired, The tea must still be trying to give him his strength. Think Toshi may know something? Asked 𝗬𝗪. No. More so since he hasn't really spoken to anyone but me. And even that isn't much. Inko said with a soft sigh. Temple, far east, many lost. Came Toshi's words, causing Inko to look down at the wolf in shock. Did he really just give them some kind of clue as to where to go? Toshi. Head before the wolf laid his head back on his large paws. Inko frowned a little as she reached down and rubbed Toshi's ear, causing him to look up at her. Toshi, what do you know about the temples? Lost. Many lost. Must learn there. Unable to tell, sorry. Toshi calmly said before resting his head back onto his paws once more. That bothered Inko a little, but knew that she couldn't force Toshi to do as she pleased. It wasn't right. She knew that better than anyone else. To make people to do what they wanted, because they were, in a sense, yours, then it wasn't right. Letting out a soft sigh, the young woman looked back up at her friends as she asked, So, do you guys know anything about possession? Yeah, demons or ghosts can easily possess you to do as they please. Some demons do it to kill or feed off of the soul of the one they possess. Ghosts, they do it for kicks or to feel like they are alive once again. 𝗬𝗪 calmly answered, causing both the blonde and green-haired young woman to stare at him in shock. What? How could you answer that so quickly? Asked Inko. Yeah, that's kind of freaky. I get bored sometimes, so I look things up. So Inko, why do you want to know? Toshi can possess people, though his control is rather weak. Inko said, then went into detail to what happened when Toshi possessed the student that had been bothering her for weeks, maybe longer than that at this point. She lost track, and how Toshi was making him eat like a pig and beating himself up to make him hurt. 𝗬𝗪 blinked his tired eyes at her for a moment, trying to think on what was going on about this, though felt like there was much more to Inko stared at her friend with wide eyes. Of course it scared her, knowing that he could possess her, or anyone for that matter. Even though she knew at the time he only did it was to protect her. It had her curious as to why he was so protective of her, more than any other demon would be of their witch or wizard. At the moment, she had no idea as to how that would be, or what she should do about it. Rubbing at her face, leaning forward on the table, Inko said, It does. It frightens me that he can easily take control over someone's body like it was child's play. I know he hasn't tried that with me, but I hope to never see such a thing ever again. To know that he could just as easily kill someone while controlling them. What if he does it to me? Hisashi reached over and patted Inko's back as he said, Inko, I highly doubt that he would take control over you. He cares about your well-being. Look at what he did just to make sure that you were safe. He stopped that bully in 2 ways. Scaring him off, then possessing him. Inko gave him a frown, tears building up within her green eyes. I know it's scary, Inko. Kazumi worries me as well. She can easily blow out my eardrums if she wanted to, but doesn't. When she needs to use that magic, she alerts me, so I can better prepare myself. Don't worry about a thing. Inko couldn't help but look toward Toshi, wondering what she was supposed to think about this. Of course, she was going to worry about it, though knew that she couldn't really blame him either. Either way, she would always be concerned about him because he was her familiar, and she wanted to make sure that he was safe and healthy. Taking a deep breath, the young woman looked up at her friends as she said, I just don't want him to do it anymore. I know it was only the once, but what if next time he kills someone? Inko, you are worrying over nothing. I highly doubt that he would do anything to upset you again. Familiars do what they can to protect their witch or wizard. That is just how they are. They are protective. Hisashi pointed out with a frown on his face. He has a point, Inko. Usagi once tried to claw someone's eyes out for me when they shoved me because I called them an idiot. 𝗬𝗪𝗏 mumbled softly. Inko blinked before laying her head on the table and groaned a little. I know he wouldn't do it to hurt me, but I don't know what I can do. I'm just worried about what to do. I don't think he'll do it, but I'm worried that he'll do it in the end. I don't even know what other powers he has other than his nightmare illusion, or whatever it was called. Inko sighed softly before rubbing at her face. Meanwhile, Toshi had heard everything, could feel Inko's concern, fear and worry from their bond. He knew that he couldn't do that again, not if it concerned Inko this much. Closing his eyes for a brief moment, the wolf knew that he would have to try other means in order to protect her, to make sure that Inko was always safe. Though, if he wanted her to learn more of her magical powers, better, then she would have to go to the temples. For you can learn a lot from times long forgotten.